Have you ever sat in a church that had been closed for years and felt, somewhere under the floorboards or behind the plaster of the walls, that the building was still holding its breath between one word and the next? Not the cold, not the dust, something older than both of those things. The sense that a sentence had been spoken in that room so many times, from so many mouths, in so many seasons of heat and cold and grief and ordinary Tuesday morning trouble, that the room itself had learned the sentence and could not stop saying it, even after the last voice went out, even after the doors were nailed, even after the weeds came up through the steps. There is a hollow in the hill country of eastern Tennessee that people in the surrounding townships have called Weeping Hollow, for as long as anyone can trace the name back, which is not as far back as the hollow itself goes, and the name is older than the church, and the church is older than anyone still living. The church is called Calvary Rest. It sits at the head of the hollow on a shelf of flat ground where a spring comes out of the hillside and runs south in a shallow channel through the grass, and it has sat there since the summer of 1863, when the men who built it were taking turns sleeping with a rifle across the door, because the war was not finished with that county yet, and the county was not finished fighting back. The last regular service at Calvary Rest was held on Sunday, the 9th of March, 1961. There were 11 people in the pews. There had been 114 the previous Easter. The preacher that morning was a man named Orrin Gaddis, who was 62 years old and had served that congregation for 23 years, and who would never, in any account he gave of that morning for the rest of his life, say what he read from the pulpit. He did not say he forgot. He did not say it was nothing. He said, plainly, to every person who ever pressed him about it, that he had read a thing he had not chosen to read, and that he would not repeat it, and that the people who had been in that room already knew it anyway, and that the people who had not been there were better off. 11 people. One preacher. A Sunday in March, 1961. And whatever was read from that pulpit that morning, it ended something. The doors were locked that afternoon, and they were never opened for worship again, and the 11 people who walked out of Calvary Rest at the end of that service scattered to 4 different counties over the following 8 months, and 2 of them refused for the rest of their lives to speak the name of the hollow out loud. I am going to tell you the whole of it tonight. Every piece of it I can put my hands on. And I am going to tell you what Orrin Gaddis read that morning, because I have it now, and because I believe you need to hear it the way he heard it, which is to say, slowly, after everything that led up to it, so that, by the time we get there, you already understand why it ended a church, and scattered a congregation, and kept a 62-year-old preacher awake for the last 19 years of his life. Before I go on, if this is the kind of case you would want a long winter's worth of, not one night of it, but many, there is a collection I have been putting together called What the Hollow Keeps. 12 cases from the hill country and the ridge country and the low dark bottom country, 12 Sundays and Saturday nights and October mornings, when something that should have been ordinary turned into something else, about 11 hours of them altogether, meant to be listened to low and quiet with the lights down. The link is down below and pinned at the top of the comments. And before we go any further, tell me where you are listening from tonight. Just the town, or the county, or wherever in the world this has found you. Put it in the comments. I want to see how far this one reaches. And if you have not yet, go on and hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means the next one finds you on the next long night. Now then, let me give you the place first, because the place in this case is not a setting. The place is a participant. Weeping Hollow runs roughly northeast to southwest in Landers County, Tennessee, which sits in the eastern part of the state, in a fold of the Cumberland Plateau, where the ridges come in at angles and the hollows between them collect cold air and morning fog, and about 6 weeks more of winter than the flat country. Below, the hollow itself is about 2.5 miles long. The road that follows it is a gravel road that was graded by the county in 1939 and has been regraded roughly every 7 years since, and it has never been paved, and the county has never proposed paving it, and anyone who drives it in the wet season understands why. At the head of the hollow, where the road ends, the ground rises sharply to a bench about 100 feet above the hollow floor, and the bench is level and well-drained and faces south, and the spring comes out of the hillside at its north edge and runs down through the grass to a stone-lined channel that somebody built at some point nobody can date. On that bench, since the summer of 1863, has stood Calvary Rest. The building is frame construction, white clapboard, a gable roof, a small bell tower on the west end where the bell was removed in 1944 for a scrap drive and never replaced. The foundation is dry-laid limestone, and the limestone is older than the building, and the building is on the bench because the limestone is on the bench, and the limestone is there because somebody put it there, in courses, before the war, and possibly before the people who fought the war were born. You can see the old foundation through the floor of the church if you lift the trapdoor in the northeast corner, which nobody has done in a long time, and which I will come back to. The interior is one room, 32 feet by 20 feet. 12 pews on each side of a center aisle, pine, worn pale on the seat surfaces, and dark on the backs, bolted to the floor. At the front, a raised platform 2 steps up, and on the platform, a plain oak pulpit, and behind the pulpit, fixed to the wall, a wooden cross about 4 feet tall that was put there in the fall of 1864 by a man named Absalom Gentry, who had built the church and who wanted it known that something in that building was permanent. The cross is still there. The building is still standing. The doors have been nailed since 1961, and the windows have been boarded since 1968, when someone threw a rock through 2 of them, and the county owns the property now, has owned it since the congregation dissolved and the last trustee died, and the county has done nothing with it and proposes nothing. And the people who work in the county building in the county seat 22 miles down the road will tell you, if you ask the right person in the right tone of voice, that the property has been on the disposition list for 30 years and that every time it comes up for a decision, someone finds a reason to table it, and they are not sure they are ever going to stop finding reasons. I want to give you the history of that building now, because the history is not background. It is the whole architecture of what happened in March of 1961, and if I skip it, we will arrive at the end, and it will be only a strange story about an old preacher, and it is not that. It is something that was built, slowly, over 98 years, by the accumulation of things that happened in one room, and by the accumulation of things that were said in one room, and by the particular quality of silence that fills a room where the same words have been spoken aloud, in the same order, at the same hour, week after week, for nearly a century. Calvary Rest was founded in 1863 by a congregation of 12 families who had been attending services in the house of a man named Luther Fane, about 3 miles down the hollow, and who needed a building because Luther Fane's house had burned. And because the times were such that meeting in the open air was not advisable if you were 12 families with women and children, and you did not know which way the next raiding party would come from, they built it in 4 weekends in June and July of that year. Absalom Gentry ran the project. He was a carpenter by trade and a stubborn man by nature, and the building he put up was meant to last, and it has. The first preacher of Calvary Rest was a man named Hiram Close, who served from 1863 to 1881, 18 years, and who is buried in the churchyard on the east side of the building with a sandstone marker that has gone too smooth to read. After Hiram Close came a man named Delbert Fane, who was the grandson of Luther Fane, and who served 11 years, 1881 to 1892. After Delbert Fane came a man named James Cotter, who served 16 years. After James Cotter came a man named Rupert Shambley, who lasted 3 years and left abruptly in 1911 for reasons that the church minutes record as personal calling elsewhere, which is the same language those minutes use in 1911 that the Calhoun County School Board used in West Virginia 80 years later. And I do not think that is a coincidence. After Rupert Shambley came a woman named Beulah Marsh, who served as acting pastor for 7 months in 1911 and 12 while the congregation searched for a permanent preacher, and who left no record in those minutes of her own feelings about the building or the hollow, except for one sentence. In the meeting notes of September of 1911, where she was asked whether she intended to continue, and she said she did not, and when she was asked why, she said that a building remembers everything that has been said in it, and that she had said everything in her that she intended that building to have. Nobody asked her what she meant by that. The minutes do not record anyone asking. After Beulah Marsh came a long succession of men who stayed shorter and shorter terms, until 1938, when Orrin Gaddis arrived. Orrin Gaddis was born in 1900 in Barton County, Tennessee, the youngest of 6 children of a coal company surveyor, and a woman who played piano for 3 different churches simultaneously and kept it a secret from all 3. He was educated at a Bible college in Knoxville, which no longer exists, and he was ordained in 1925, and he served 2 small congregations in the flat country west of the plateau before he came to Weeping Hollow in 1938 at the age of 38, when the Calvary Rest congregation was down to 31 members and had not had a settled pastor in 14 months. He stayed 23 full years. He was the last preacher that building ever had, the longest any who served Calvary Rest in history. The next longest was Hiram Close at 18 years, and after those 2 it falls off quickly. The average over the whole history of the congregation is about 5 years. Orrin Gaddis arrived in 1938 and left in 1961, and in those 23 years he buried 59 members of that congregation and baptized 31 and married 22 couples, and visited an uncountable number of sickbeds and sat up an uncountable number of nights in farmhouses where a family was waiting out a death, which is the largest and least described part of what a country preacher does. He knew every family in that hollow and the surrounding country for a radius of about 8 miles, and they knew him and they trusted him, and for the last 12 years of his ministry he drove a 1949 Chevrolet pickup, blue, that the congregation had bought him used in 1952, and that he drove until it finally refused to start one morning in 1963. And he did not replace it because by that time he was 63 years old and had nowhere left he needed to go. He was a big man, tall and wide through the chest, with large hands that were always slightly chapped from the cold, and a face that had gone the color of old saddle leather from 23 years of outdoor visiting. He was not a soft preacher. He did not say comfortable things. He was the kind of man who, when he sat down in a family's kitchen in a bad time, did not offer pleasantries or claim things were going to be fine. He sat down and he was there, which is sometimes the hardest thing, and he had learned over 23 years to do it without fidgeting, and people remembered it. He also had, by every account, an extraordinary memory for text, not just scripture, text of any kind. He had read broadly, and he retained what he read in a way that made it available to him at any moment, and his sermons were, by the testimony of people who heard them, unlike the sermons of any other preacher in the county, because he did not preach the obvious interpretations of the obvious passages. He worked the corners of the text. He found the passages that nobody preached on because they were uncomfortable or strange or did not resolve cleanly, and he preached on those, and people did not always like it, and they came back anyway. He preached from a Bible that had been given to him by his mother when he was ordained, a King James Bible, red letter edition, with his name written in her hand on the flyleaf, Orrin Wesley Gaddis, May of 1925. He carried that Bible to Calvary Rest every Sunday for 23 years, and the congregation last saw him carry it out of the building on the morning of March 9, 1961. And by the time the people who knew him went looking for it after his death, it was gone. Now, I need to tell you what I am working from, because this is a documentary, and I will not ask you to take anything on trust that can be verified. There are 5 bodies of material for this case. The first is the church record. Calvary Rest Congregational Church, Landers County, Tennessee, records 1863 to 1961. Minutes of monthly business meetings, membership rolls, financial accounts, burial records, baptismal records, marriage records, 98 years of a congregation's administrative life, kept in a series of 12-bound volumes. These records were removed from the church in the summer of 1961 by the last Board of Deacons, a body of 2 men at that point, and held in the home of a family named Pressler for 40 years, and donated to the Tennessee State Library and Archives in 2002 by the Pressler granddaughter, who had found them in a cedar chest and understood, correctly, that they belonged somewhere people could look at them. I have looked at them. The last volume covers 1940 to 1961, and the final entry in it, in the handwriting of the church clerk, a woman named Harriet Deal, is dated March 9, 1961, and it reads as follows. Service held, 11 present, final, 2 words, final, and then nothing. 81 pages left in the volume, blank. The second body of material is the Landers County Deed and Property Record, which tells us the physical history of the building and the land, and which contains one entry that I will draw your attention to when we get to it, because it is in the wrong place in the record, and nobody who maintained that office noticed it or noticed when it appeared, and it is the oldest thing in the case. The third body of material is a collection of oral history interviews conducted in the 1980s by a professor of regional studies at a college in Cookeville, a woman named Dr. Lavinia Stout, who spent 11 years traveling the Plateau counties collecting the testimonies of elderly residents about community institutions, including churches. She interviewed 7 people who had been members of Calvary Rest at various points in its history. 5 of those interviews are on tape. 2 she transcribed by hand because the subjects refused to be recorded. One of those 2 is Orrin Gaddis, who sat with her for 3.5 hours in the kitchen of his house in Barton County in the spring of 1983, and who gave her more than she asked for and less than she needed, and whose transcript runs to 41 pages, and which I have read until the margins are worn. The fourth body of material is the journal of a woman named Cressida Ogle, who was a member of Calvary Rest from 1916 to 1953 when she moved to live with her daughter in Chattanooga. She was born in 1897, and she died in 1971. She kept journals from the age of 17 to the age of 72, 55 journals, and her daughter donated all 55 to the Historical Society in Landers County in 1973, where they sit in a metal box in a back room, and I have spent time with 11 of the ones that cover her years in the hollow. And the fifth body of material is a thing I am going to describe when we get to it, because describing it now will not mean the same thing as describing it at the point where it matters. I will tell you only that it was found in the wall of a building that is not the church, and that what was written in it was not written for anyone to find, and that the woman who wrote it understood that perfectly and wrote it anyway. Those are the 5. When I am guessing, I will say so. When something is only in one source and confirmed nowhere else, I will say so. And when 2 sources disagree, as they do twice, I will give you both versions and let you hold them. Now, Orrin Gaddis, and what the hollow did to him, and what he did to the hollow back. When Gaddis arrived in 1938, the congregation was small, and it was thin, and it was stubborn in the way that congregations get when they have held on through hard times. The Depression had been working on Landers County for 9 years, and it had taken a toll. And the Hollow families in particular had pulled in close, the way isolated people pull in when money is tight and the roads are bad, and the center of the community is the place you walk to on Sunday morning and then walk home from. For those families, Calvary Rest was not a luxury. It was the axle the week turned on. The building when Gaddis arrived was in reasonable condition, considering the roof had been patched twice in the 30s. The stove in the back corner was adequate, which in a building that size in a Tennessee winter meant cold in the pews and comfortable within about 6 feet of the stove. The pews were sound, the pulpit was sound, the cross on the front wall was sound, and the floor, under which the old limestone foundation sat in the dark, was sound, with one exception. The trap door in the northeast corner. It was a square door, about 18 inches by 18 inches, set into the floor with iron hinges that had gone red with rust. Nobody in the congregation in 1938 could tell him what was under it. The oldest member at the time, a woman named Ethel Pursley, who was then 81 years old and had been attending Calvary Rest since she was 4 years old in the 1860s, told him that she did not know what was under the trap door, and that she did not want to know, and that the previous 4 preachers had felt the same way, and that if he was wise, he would leave it. He left it. For 18 years he left it, from 1938 to 1956. He was a practical man, and a busy man, and there was always something more urgent, and the trapdoor held no special fascination for him. He was not drawn to it. He walked over it every Sunday morning when he came down the aisle to the pulpit, and he did not think about it more than you think about a board in a floor. What changed in 1956 was the singing. I need to take a moment here and tell you about the music at Calvary Rest, because the music is the thread that runs through this entire case, and if you do not understand the music, you will not understand. The 9th of March, 1961. Calvary Rest did not have a piano until 1929. Before that, the music was unaccompanied shape-note singing, which is a particular tradition of 4-part harmony, using a system of notation that assigns geometric shapes to the notes of the scale and which produces a sound unlike any other kind of church music. If you have heard it, you know what I mean. If you have not, it is difficult to describe, because it is not polished and it is not soft, and it is not the kind of music that asks you to sit back and receive it. It is music that requires participation, and it will take everyone in the room and hold them if there are enough voices. The families of Weeping Hollow knew that music. They had grown up in it. The hymns of the tradition are old, some of them very old, and the words in many of them are not the comfortable words of later Protestant hymnody, but the harder, older words, the words about judgment and the grave, and the things that wait beyond both, and they sang them every Sunday in their 4 parts. In the wooden building on the bench above the spring, and the building held the sound the way a bell holds a tone after you stop striking it. The piano came in 1929, bought by subscription, and transported up the hollow on a wagon, and it changed the sound. Not replaced the shape-note tradition, changed it. The old hymns continued, but alongside them came the newer gospel songs, the simpler melodies, and the congregation slowly became a mixed thing, old and new together, which is what most small congregations in that country were by the middle of the 20th century. But there was one thing that did not change, and that the congregation had not noticed was unusual until Orrin Gaddis mentioned it in his 2nd year. At Calvary Rest, the congregation always sang one more verse. That is the phrase, one more verse. It was not a phrase anyone used, but it was what happened. In every hymnal in regular use, the hymns have a fixed number of verses printed on the page, 3, or 4, or sometimes 5. When you sing a hymn in church, you sing all the printed verses and then the final chorus, and then you stop. That is how it is done. At Calvary Rest, the congregation would reach the last printed verse, and they would sing it, and then they would sing it again. Not obviously, not like a mistake. They did not look at each other or consult. They simply went into the verse again as a body, all of them together, as though they had all turned to the same page of a hymnal that no one could see. They sang one more verse every time without planning it or naming it. And the verse they sang was not always the same as the last printed verse. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was something else. Words that nobody could account for afterward, words that were not in the printed text, sung in the voices of the congregation without hesitation or uncertainty. Gaddis had noticed it by the end of his first month, and had assumed he was mishearing or misremembering the texts. He had checked, in the 3rd week, by following his own copy of the hymnal with his finger, and he had confirmed that the congregation had gone past the text, and he had said nothing for a year, because he was new, and because the congregation did not seem to notice, and because the extra verses, whatever they were, sounded like the hymns they came from, just a bit farther along, just a bit deeper. In his 2nd year, he mentioned it to Cressida Ogle, who was then in her 40s and was the person he had come by that point to trust for the institutional memory of the congregation. She was a small, sharp woman with gray eyes and a good memory, and no patience for being managed. He described what he had observed. She looked at him for a while, and then she said, "Preacher, this congregation has been singing in this building every Sunday for 75 years. And she said, "A building that has heard that much singing does not just hear it and let it go." And she said, "Whatever you are hearing in that extra verse, it has been in the walls of this building since before either of us was born." And then she said, "Leave it alone." He left it alone. For another 18 years he left it alone. He was a man who could leave things alone when he decided that was the right approach. But he never stopped noticing the extra verse, and he never stopped listening to what was in it. And over 23 years of listening, he came to understand that the extra verse was not random, and was not repetition, and was not a mistake. It was memory. The building was singing back what it had heard, and what it sang back was always one further than where the congregation was, one step ahead, one verse deeper, and sometimes what it sang back was from a hymn that the congregation had not sung that morning, or that morning's year, or possibly in living memory. Now let me tell you what happened in 1956, and why it made Orrin Gaddis open the trap door. In the spring of 1956, 3 things happened at Calvary Rest in the space of about 6 weeks, and Gaddis believed, to the end of his life, that they were the same thing in 3 different forms. The first was a change in the spring. The spring that came out of the hillside at the north edge of the bench had run every day of every year since the building went up, and before that, and everyone in the hollow drank from it and watered their animals from it and trusted it, because it had never failed. In March of 1956, the spring began running at a different temperature, not warmer or colder, neither. It began running at the same temperature it had always run, which was cool, reliably, and pleasantly cool, even in August, even in the driest years. But something about the coolness had changed in a way that people noticed and could not describe precisely. The man who first mentioned it was a farmer named Hobart Gentry, who was the great-nephew of Absalom Gentry, who had built the building, and who came to Gaddis after the 3rd Sunday in March of that year and said that the spring tasted different, and that he did not mean the flavor, and that he was not sure he could explain further. He said it felt different coming out of his hands. He said it felt like water that had come from somewhere deeper than a hillside spring had any business coming from. Gaddis went and put his hands in the spring that afternoon. He knelt in the grass in the cold of a March afternoon and put his hands in the outflow of that spring for a long time. He did not describe to Dr. Stout precisely what he felt, except to say that the sensation was not one he had an adequate word for in his experience, and that the closest he could come was that the water felt like it knew where it was going. The second thing was a sound in the building. Beginning sometime in April of 1956, on the mornings when Gaddis came early to open the church, he began to hear something inside the building before he opened the door. He described it to Dr. Stout as a low sound, not a definable note, not a voice, not an instrument, a sustained vibration, very low, the kind of sound you feel in the floor before you hear it in the air. It stopped when he opened the door, or rather, it did not stop. Exactly. It faded back into the general quiet of the building, the way something dims when you bring more light. He heard it on 17 consecutive Saturday mornings from April through July, and then it stopped, or stopped being audible, which he thought might not be the same thing. And the third thing was the verse. In the second Sunday of May, 1956, the congregation sang an old hymn that had been in the shape note tradition since before any of them were born, a hymn about the soul coming home at the end of its time, and they sang the printed verses, and then they sang the extra verse, as they always did, and the extra verse was different from anything the building had given back before. Gaddis was standing at the pulpit, and he heard it come. He heard the congregation go into it together, that same unified move into the unprinted verse, and what he heard in that verse was not a verse of the hymn they had been singing. It was words he did not recognize, in the rhythm of the hymn, but about something he could not immediately place. And then he placed it, and the placing of it is the thing he could not make himself describe fully to Dr. Stout even 27 years later. He said only that the words were about the foundation, that they were about what the building sat on, that they were, in the language of the old hymns, which uses certain words for certain things, in ways that were set a long time ago, about what was underneath, and about how long it had been there, and about what it remembered. And then the congregation stopped, as they always did after the extra verse, and there was the usual settling into the next part of the service. And Gaddis stood at his pulpit and looked at the 11 people left in that room, and he was a 62-year-old man who had spent his whole adult life inside the tradition of those hymns, who knew every line of every verse of every song in every hymnal he had ever opened, and he had never in his life heard those words, and he had no idea where they had come from, and he understood for the first time that they had been there longer than he had. He opened the trapdoor on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of May, 1956, alone with a lamp. I want to slow down here, because this is the hinge of the case, and I want to give it the space it earns. The trapdoor was in the northeast corner of the building. The hinges had rusted, but they moved. He used a pry bar on them, and they moved. He lifted the door and held the lamp down into the opening and looked. What was under there was not a root cellar. It was not a storage space. It was not anything a practical person would have put under a church floor for a practical reason. What was under there was the old foundation, the limestone foundation that predated the building by an indeterminate amount of time. And the foundation was not just courses of stacked stone. It was a room, roughly square, about 8 feet by 8 feet, the walls built up of fitted limestone without mortar, tight enough that nothing grew between the courses. A dirt floor, a low ceiling, the underside of the church floorboards, so that a man who went down into it would have to crouch, and the walls. The walls of that room were covered in writing, not graffiti, not scratched names or dates of the kind people leave in any concealed space. Writing, text, in a controlled hand, in several different hands over what was clearly a long period of time, written in a substance that had soaked into the limestone so deeply that it was part of the stone. Gaddis held the lamp to the wall and read, and he was there for a long time. He did not describe to Dr. Stout what he read. He described the experience of reading it, which he said was unlike any reading experience he had had before or after, because the text was not linear. It was not a narrative that ran from one point to another. It was layered, different hands, different periods, written over each other and beside each other, and sometimes through each other, so that reading it required you to read many things at once, the way you might read if several voices were speaking simultaneously and you were trying to catch all of them without losing any. What he did say, and what he said carefully, choosing the words slowly in a way that Dr. Stout described in her transcript as characteristic of the parts of the interview where Gaddis was being most precise, was this. He said, "There are texts in the world, scripture and otherwise, that have been copied out so many times by so many different hands over so many centuries that they are no longer just texts. They are something else. They have been thought about and spoken and written and thought about and spoken and written again until the thinking and the speaking and the writing have worked into the material of the text in a way that changes what the text is. The words are still the words, but the words are not all that is there." And he said, "What was on those walls was a text like that, except that it was not a copied text. It was a remembered text, and the remembering had changed it. He did not go back down for 2 years. In those 2 years, from 1956 to 1958, he served his congregation. He preached on Sundays, he visited the sick, he buried the dead, he did the unremarkable and essential work of a country preacher, and he said nothing to anyone about what he had seen in the room under the floor, and he walked over the trapdoor every Sunday morning without looking at it. But the congregation had changed, or the building had changed, or he had changed in his perception of both, and he could not decide which of those things was true. What he noticed was this. The extra verse, after May of 1956, was different, not in degree, in kind. Before, it had been a coda, an extension, one step beyond where the printed text left off. After, it was something else. It was as though the congregation were singing back to the building instead of the building singing to the congregation, as though something in those 4 walls had been addressed directly in May of 1956, when the words about the foundation came up out of the unprinted verse and was now in conversation. Gaddis used that word, conversation. He used it once, and then he said it was not the right word, and that he did not have the right word, and Dr. Stout noted in the margin of her transcript that he appeared genuinely troubled by the inadequacy of his vocabulary, which she noted because he was otherwise a man who was not troubled by such things. What he could say, with precision, was that from the summer of 1956 onward, the building responded faster, that the interval between the congregation's verse and the building's verse shortened, and then shortened again, so that by the spring of 1958 it was almost simultaneous, almost as though the building were not waiting to hear what the congregation sang, but were anticipating it, and singing along, and sometimes singing a breath or two ahead. He went back down in the spring of 1958, the second week of March. This time he was prepared. He brought better light, 2 lamps, and he brought paper and a pencil, and he spent 4 hours in that room. What he discovered on the second visit was that the text on the walls had grown. He was certain of this. He had looked at those walls closely 2 years before, and there was text on them that had not been there. He could not prove it by any means available to him. He had no photographs of the first visit. He could not date the editions, because the substance they were written in defied his amateur attempts to date it, and he was not going to bring a stranger into that space. But he was as certain as he was of anything that the text had grown, and the growth was not random. It was structured. It was additions to things already there, continuations of passages he had read 2 years before, and in some places it was responses, one voice answering another. He copied what he could. He spent 4 hours copying, on his knees in the dirt of that floor in the lamplight, and what he copied went into a notebook that he kept for the rest of his life, and I will tell you what happened to that notebook in a moment. He came back up into the church that afternoon, and he lowered the trapdoor, and he knelt in the church above the trapdoor in the northeast corner, and he prayed for a long time. He was 58 years old, and he had been praying for 40 years, and he knew what prayer felt like, and he said that what he felt in that corner, above that room, was something he had not felt before in prayer, which was that the prayer went somewhere. Not that prayer usually felt empty. He had never felt that. But this felt different. It felt like sending a message to an address, and knowing, this time, without any doubt at all, that the address was real and that the recipient was home. He did not find that comforting. He found it terrifying, and he said so to Dr. Stout. And he said that any person of genuine faith who tells you they are never terrified by the presence of the divine has either never felt it or is lying. Now I need to tell you about Cressida Ogle's journal, because the journal is the witness to what happened in the congregation during those years, and Gaddis himself is too close to it to be objective. Cressida Ogle had been writing in her journals since 1914, and by the time we reached 1956, she was in her late 50s, and her journals had become what journals become for a person who has kept them a long time, which is less a daily record and more a sustained conversation with herself about what she was observing and what it meant. She was not a credulous woman. She was a Baptist by upbringing and a skeptic by temperament, and she had stayed at Calvary Rest through many years and many changes because she loved the community more than she needed to be comfortable, which is a sentence she wrote about herself in 1947, and which I think is the most accurate self-assessment in any of the documents I have read for this case. Her journal entries for the spring and summer of 1956 show a woman who is paying careful attention to something she does not want to name. In April of that year she wrote, "The singing was different again today. Not worse. Not better in the way that better means practiced or polished. Different in the way that a room is different after a long silence ends." In May, the Sunday of the extra verse that Gaddis had described, she wrote, "Something was answered today, and I do not know what the question was." In June, she wrote a longer entry, 3 pages, which I am going to condense because the full text deserves its own treatment, but the heart of it is this. She wrote that she had been attending services in that building for 40 years, and that she knew, in the way you know a person after 40 years, the difference between the building in its ordinary state and the building in what she called its other state, and that the other state had been persistent now since March, which was longer than she had ever known it to persist, and that she had asked 3 other long-term members whether they felt it, and 2 of them had said yes, and 1 had said she was tired and old and should let things alone. She wrote, "I am not tired and I am not old in any way that matters to this question. Something has been woken up in that building, and it was woken up from a great depth, and it is not going back down." 1957, 58, 59. The congregation dwindled. That is the plain fact. Between 1956 and 1961, the membership of Calvary Rest went from 47 to 11, and the going was not all at once. It was gradual. One family and then another, the way a shoreline recedes in a dry season. The reasons given, when reasons were given, were ordinary reasons. The Holden family moved to Knoxville for work. The Gerber family joined a congregation in town because the drive was more manageable. The Pressler children, grown and gone, took their parents with them to a church near their home. But Cressida Ogle, in her journals, gives a different account. She writes about a quality of unease that settled into the congregation during those years, and that the unease was not about anything anyone could put a name to, but that it made people restless in the pews and inclined to leave early, and that the ones who left early did not, as a rule, come back. She writes about conversations in the churchyard after services, conversations she was part of, and conversations she observed from a distance, and she writes that the subject of those conversations was always the same subject even when the words were about something else entirely, and that the subject was what was happening to the music. Because by 1959, the extra verse was happening during the service, not just at the end of the hymns. That is the point where it changed, and the point where it began to frighten people in a way they could not explain to themselves. The congregation would be in the middle of a hymn, the third verse, say, and the building would give back the fourth verse, the next verse, before they had sung it, so that for a moment there were two hymns happening simultaneously, the congregation singing what was printed and the building singing what was coming. And then the congregation would arrive at the fourth verse, and they would sing it, and the building would give back the fifth, and on until the hymn ran out of printed verses, and the building gave back something that had no printed source, something that was one verse beyond the tradition, one step into territory that nobody in that room had mapped. Cressida wrote about this in October of 1959 in terms that are precise and careful, and that I want to quote directly because they are the best description of what was happening that I have found in any of the 5 sources. She wrote, "It is not that the building is predicting what we will sing. It is not that it knows our hymns better than we do, though that may also be true. It is that the building is singing a version of the hymn that is longer than the version we know. Our version ends where it was written to end. The building's version keeps going. It knows the rest of the hymn. It knows verses that were never written down, that maybe were never spoken aloud before they came out of those walls, and the question that I cannot stop asking myself is this: where did those verses come from? Who has been singing them in there while we were not listening?" The congregation was down to 31 members in 1956 and 11 by March of 1961, and Cressida Ogle was one of the 11. I want to stop here and take a breath and tell you what I need to tell you about the ledger in the wall, and then I want to come back to Orrin Gaddis and the last 5 years of that church's life, and then I am going to take you to the morning of March 9th, 1961. If you have been with me this long, if you are this deep into this thing, drop something in the comments. Let me know where you are. And the collection I mentioned at the start, What the Hollow Keeps, is linked below. 12 cases, 11 hours. Every one of them built like this one, from the ground up. Go on and check it out when you have a chance. Now, the ledger, the building that held the ledger, was not the church. It was the spring house, the small stone structure that covered and protected the spring outflow at the north edge of the bench, built sometime in the 19th century, probably before the church, probably when the spring was the reason for the bench being a useful place at all. The spring house is about 7 feet by 5 feet, stone walls, a stone floor over the outflow channel, a wooden roof that has been replaced several times, and is currently a metal roof put on in the 1990s by the Landers County Historical Society, which also stabilized the walls. In the spring of 2003, during the stabilization work, a stone in the east wall of the spring house was found to be loose, and when it was removed, the workmen found, in the space behind it, a tin box of the kind that would have been used for tea or tobacco, and in the tin box, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone dark and stiff with age, a small book. The book is about 5 inches by 3 inches. The cover is marbled paper over boards, worn at the corners. The pages are handmade, rag paper, stitched into the cover, and the writing in them is in iron gall ink that has browned with age but remained readable. The pages are numbered in the writer's hand. The book has no title page. The first page begins mid-sentence, which tells you it is not the beginning, which tells you there was another book before it, which has not been found. The hand is a woman's hand. I am confident of this based on the style and the letter forms, and the writing is educated, careful, deliberate. This is not a woman writing in haste. This is a woman who has thought about what she is writing and has chosen each word. The date of the first entry that has a legible date is in the second week of November, 1868. The date of the last entry is the 22nd of January, 1870. The name at the bottom of several entries, not all, is Mabel Gentry. Mabel Gentry was the wife of Absalom Gentry, who built the church. She was born in 1835, and she died in 1870, in January. And she is buried in the churchyard on the east side of the building, 4 rows back from the front, in a grave that is marked with a limestone slab that has been recut twice to keep the letters readable. She wrote this book in the last 14 months of her life, and she put it behind a stone in the spring house, and she did not tell anyone it was there, and it was there for 135 years before anyone found it. I am going to read you portions of it, not the whole thing, because the whole thing is long, and because some of it is personal, in ways that do not belong to a story like this one. I am going to read you the parts that speak to what was happening at Calvary Rest, because Mabel Gentry was paying attention to it from the beginning, from the very first years of the building's existence, and what she wrote is the earliest witness account we have of what that building was doing with what it heard. The first passage I want to give you is from November of 1868, 5 years after the church was built. She wrote, "Absalom says it is the acoustics of the building that makes the singing sound the way it does, and he may be right. He knows wood and stone in ways I do not. But I have sat in other buildings that were built by skilled men, and I have never heard anything like what I hear in that room on Sunday morning. The singing in that room is larger than the number of voices making it. It has always been larger. From the first Sunday we ever sang in it, it has been larger than us. I asked Absalom once if he heard it too, and he said he heard good singing, and that was all he knew. And I did not press him, because there are things in a building that a man who built it cannot hear, because he hears the building he built, not the building that has been living in itself since he stopped working on it. November 1868. 5 years in. She already knew. She had been sitting in that room every Sunday for 5 years, and she already knew the sound was bigger than the congregation. The second passage is from March of 1869. She wrote, "Today the congregation sang the third verse of a hymn that has only 2. Nobody mentioned this. I watched the faces of the people in the pews to see if anyone would look up from their hymnals in confusion, and nobody did, and afterward I asked 2 people separately what they had sung, and one of them told me the first 2 verses and stopped, and one of them told me the first 2 verses, and then, after a pause, told me the third. And when I asked her what the third one said, she could not remember. Exactly, only that it had made her feel like she was standing closer to something large than she usually stood." The third passage is from June of 1869, and this is the one that I most want you to have, and that most directly connects to what Orrin Gaddis found in the room under the floor. She wrote, "I have been thinking about the old foundation, the foundation that was here before the building. Absalom found it when he was preparing the site, and he built on it because it was good level stone, and it saved 3 weeks of work. He does not know who laid it. Nobody knows. I have asked the oldest people in the hollow, and none of them know who built the old foundation, only that it was here when they came. And I have begun to think that the old foundation is part of what I am hearing in the singing. That the stone has been holding something, all the years it sat here before anyone put a building over it, and that now that there is a building over it, with people singing in it on Sundays, the stone is responding. The stone is singing back what it was holding, and what it was holding is older than any of us, and I do not know what it is, but I know it is not empty. That is the oldest testimony we have. 1869. Mabel Gentry, in her own plain prose, putting down in a hidden book what she had observed in the first 6 years of that building's life. The last entry in the book is dated January of 1870, and it is short. She wrote, "I am putting this away now. I have said what I needed to say, and I do not know if anyone will ever find it, but I believe something should be written down about what is in that building, so that the people who come after us will know it was noticed. We were not unobservant people. We were just not sure what to do with what we observed. I do not know what the building is doing with our singing, and I do not know what it has been doing with it for however long that foundation has been in the ground, and I do not know what it is building toward. But it is building toward something. I can feel it the way you feel weather coming before it arrives. Whatever the building is building toward, I hope the people who are in it when it arrives are ready." She died 11 days after that entry. Orrin Gaddis did not know about the book. He had no way to know about it. It was in the wall of the spring house for 90 years after he arrived at Calvary Rest, and it was in the wall for another 42 years after he left. But when Dr. Stout read the book and then went back and read her transcript of Gaddis, she found the same observation in both, made 100 years apart, by two people who never knew each other existed. The building was building toward something. Mabel Gentry said it in 1870. Orrin Gaddis said it to Dr. Stout in 1983. Without knowing, Mabel Gentry had said it first, and he said it in almost the same words. And the thing it was building toward arrived on the morning of March 9th, 1961. Now I need to tell you about the last years, 1958 to 1961. 3 years, and each one harder than the last. And Gaddis, in the middle of all of it, keeping the building open, keeping the services going, with a congregation that was down to 20, and then 15, and then 11, and that was holding on. The way things hold on when the holding is the only thing left. After his second descent into the room, under the floor, in 1958, Gaddis spent a week in Knoxville, at the university library, looking for anything that would help him understand what he had seen on those walls. He had his notebook of copied text from the room, and he looked at it in the library, and he looked at the shelves, and he was a man with a broad education, and he came up with almost nothing. Not because there was nothing, but because what was on those walls did not fit neatly into any tradition he could identify. It was not in any language he recognized, but it was not entirely in an unknown language. It was in something between, or something underneath, in the way that a geological formation is underneath the surface soil that covers it, and expresses itself occasionally through gaps in the cover. He came home with 5 books and 3 sets of notes, and a sense that he had looked in the wrong places, and he put the books on a shelf and the notes in the notebook, and went back to being the preacher of a dwindling congregation in a hollow in eastern Tennessee. But he went back into the room one more time. The third and final descent was in the autumn of 1959, and it was brief, and it was the last time he went down there. When he opened the trapdoor in the autumn of 1959, the room was different. He held the lamp into the opening and looked, and what had changed was the light, not the lamp, the room itself. There was a faint luminescence on the walls, coming from the writing, from the substance the writing was in, a blue-white glow, so faint it would have been invisible in daylight, but visible in the dark of that underground room. The text was lit from within. He went down for long enough to confirm that he was not imagining this. He held the lamp away from the wall, and the glow remained. He put his hand on the wall, and the stone was warm. Not hot, warm, the warmth of a person, or of something that had the same temperature as a living thing. He came back up. He closed the trapdoor, and he went to the pulpit, and he stood there for a while in the empty church, and then he did something that he told Dr. Stout he had not done since he was a young man, and still had the habit of urgency in prayer. He did not pray with his eyes closed or his hands folded, or in any of the postures of ordinary prayer. He stood at the pulpit with both hands on it, and he spoke aloud into the empty building. And what he spoke was not what he meant to speak. He told Dr. Stout that he had intended to pray for clarity, for guidance, for the ordinary things a pastor prays for in a difficult moment. And he said that what came out of his mouth instead was a verse from a hymn he knew, except that what he spoke was not the printed verse of that hymn. What he spoke was the next verse, the unprinted verse, the verse the building had been giving back for 96 years of Sundays, and he had no idea where it came from, and no idea how he knew it, and no idea what it meant. But it came out of his mouth fully formed, and he spoke it into the empty building, and the building answered. He was very quiet when he told Dr. Stout this. He said the building answered in the way it had been answering for years, in the singing, the layered sound, the sound bigger than its source, the sound from the walls. But this time it was answering him alone, one voice, and what it gave back was a verse he did not have, was not the next verse but the one after, the verse further along. He described it as a conversation, the same word he had used before, and this time he did not correct himself. He said he stood at that pulpit for a long time. He said the building gave him verse after verse, always one ahead of where he was, always deeper, and that the verses were about things he understood and things he did not understand, and that the ones he understood were about the foundation, about what was in the stone, about how long it had been in the stone, and that the ones he did not understand were about what came next. He said he stopped when he was afraid of what the next verse would be. He locked the church, and he went home, and he made himself a meal he did not eat, and he sat up until well past midnight. And in his account to Dr. Stout this night is one of the 2 nights in the whole narrative where you can hear, even through the distance of 22 years, that he was genuinely shaken. A man who had sat up with the dying without flinching, a man who had stood in bad weather on bad news for 23 years without losing his footing. He was shaken. He went back to the church the next Sunday, and he preached. He preached on the passage in the book of Revelation that describes the voice of many waters, and it was, by Cressida Ogle's account in her journal, the finest sermon he had ever delivered and the most frightening. She wrote, "He was preaching about what is in this building. He did not say so. He never says so. He preaches around it the way you walk around a hole in the floor, always knowing it is there, never looking directly at it. But today he came closer to it than I have ever heard him come, and I sat in my pew and I thought, he is going to name it. He is going to say out loud what is in this building, and then we will all have to decide what to do." He did not name it. Not that Sunday. The Sunday after that was different. And this is where the case begins to converge, where the 5 sources begin to point at the same thing from their 5 different angles, and where I need to take you through it carefully because the sequence matters. In the weeks between October of 1959 and March of 1961, which is 17 months, the following things happened at Calvary Rest. First, the spring changed again. The water was cold again, the right temperature, the familiar temperature. But it no longer ran continuously. It ran on Sundays. It ran from about 8 in the morning to about noon, and on the other 6 days of the week it slowed to a seep and sometimes stopped entirely. Hobart Gentry, who was the person most likely to notice changes in that spring because he lived closest to it, reported this to Gaddis in November of 1959. He said, "It knows when we are there." Gaddis said he did not respond to that. He said he was not ready to respond to it. Second, the sound in the building, the low vibration that Gaddis had heard on Saturday mornings in 1956 and that had stopped in August of that year, returned in the winter of 1960, but this time it was audible during services, not just before them. During the readings, during the sermon, beneath the human voice, There was a resonance in the building that everyone in the pews could feel in the wood of the seats and in the floor and in the soles of their feet. Nobody named it. Nobody mentioned it to Gaddis. But Cressida wrote about it in February of 1960 in her journal, and she described it as the building accompanying the service, the way a bass note under a melody accompanies and deepens it. She wrote, "It is not frightening. That is the strangest thing. It is not frightening at all. It is the most natural sound in the world. It sounds like something that has been waiting a very long time to join in." Third, the extra verse moved. I have been describing it as something that happened at the end of the hymns, or during the hymns. In 1960, it moved into the readings, into the scripture reading, into the sermon, into the responsive readings, not all the time, not every week, but with increasing frequency, the building would produce, in that low, resonant way, the next sentence of whatever was being read before the reader had read it. Gaddis described this to Dr. Stout in careful language. He said, "It was not distraction. It was not interruption. It was completion." The building was finishing what was being said before we said it, and what it added was always correct, always the right next thing, and sometimes the right next thing was a thing I had not known before I heard the building say it. He said, "I started to wonder if I was preaching at all, or if I was just repeating what the building already knew." Fourth, and this is the one that cleared the pews fastest, the building began to use names, not names from Scripture. The names of the congregation, not all of them, not every week. But beginning in the late summer of 1960, in the low resonance beneath the service, in the extra verse and the completed sentence, names began to appear. The first one Gaddis noticed was Cressida. He was in the middle of a sermon in August of 1960, and the low voice of the building said her name, said it in the middle of a sentence, incorporated it into what he had been reading, the way you incorporate a name into a sentence to address a person directly. He stopped. Cressida Ogle raised her head from her hymnal. She had heard it. She wrote about it that afternoon. She wrote, "The building said my name today, not in a strange voice, not in a frightening way. In the same tone it uses for everything, the low, resonant tone it has been developing all these years. My name, in that tone, in that building, sounded like a name being called from a great distance. Not the distance of miles, the distance of years. A name being called from a long way back in time, where someone who knew me had been waiting a long time to use it. She did not leave after that. She was one of the 11 who stayed until the end, but others left. After August of 1960, when the building began to use names, the congregation lost 3 families in 3 months. They did not announce they were leaving. They simply did not come back. Gaddis said he called on each of them, and they all told him they had found another congregation, and they all told him this in a way that closed the subject, and he let it close because he understood. By November of 1960, there were 14 people in the pews. By February of 1961, there were 11. And those 11 were the ones who would be there on the morning of March 9th. I want to tell you who those 11 were. I think you should know who was in that room. There was Gaddis himself. There was Cressida Ogle, 63 years old, who had been in that congregation for 44 years. There was Hobart Gentry, 71, the great-nephew of the builder. There was a couple named Dale and Noreen Stringer, both in their 60s, who had joined the congregation in 1942. There was a young woman named Harriet Deal, 34, who was the church clerk and who was the one who would write the last entry in the church record. There was a pair of brothers named Burl and Calvin Howell, in their 50s, who ran a small farm at the mouth of the hollow. There was a woman named Ida Merrill, 81, who had been attending services there since Gaddis arrived and possibly before, and who was one of the last living people who had been in that building in the Shape Note era. There was a man named Thurman Prater, 56, who drove up from the county seat every Sunday and had for 6 years, which suggests that whatever his reason for being there was personal in a way the records do not illuminate. And there was a young couple, Roy and Glenna Fain, who were in their late 20s and had come to the congregation 2 years before, and who were the last new members the congregation ever received. 11 people. A preacher, a long-tenured member, a member who was descended from the founder's family, a couple who had held on through 2 decades, a young woman doing her official duty, 2 brothers with a farm, an old woman, a man from town with a reason nobody asked about, and 2 young people who had arrived near the end and had stayed. Those are the people who were in Calvary Rest on the morning of March 9th, 1961. Orrin Gaddis arrived at the church at 6:30 that morning, which was earlier than usual. He told Dr. Stout that he had not slept well, that he had woken before 5 with the sense of something unresolved in him, the sense a preacher gets when he has not found the right text for the day. He said he had not been anxious about what to read that morning because he had prepared, as he always prepared, the week before. He had his text, he had his notes, he had his Bible. He had planned a quiet service, a simple service, because it was early March and the weather had been hard and the congregation was thin, and he wanted to give them something they could rest in rather than something that demanded of them. He said, "I drove up the hollow in the dark, in the blue morning, and the spring was already running." He said it was running harder than he had ever heard it run, not flooding, not overflowing its channel. Running harder, louder, with more force, in the cold of a March morning before the sun had cleared the ridge. He unlocked the church. He built the fire in the back stove. He set his Bible and his notes on the pulpit. He walked the room, which was what he did every Sunday morning before anyone arrived, a habit he had developed in his first month and kept for 23 years. He said walking the room before the congregation arrived was the way he reminded himself that the building had a life apart from the services, that it was not dormant between Sundays but was always present to itself, and walking through it before anyone came helped him meet it on its own terms before the day required him to be its interpreter. He said that morning the building was different. He did not mean different in a way that alarmed him. He said it carefully, the way he said careful things. He said, "The building was gathered. That is the word I have for it, and I know it is an odd word for a building. It felt gathered, the way a person feels when they have made a decision and the deciding is done, not tense, not waiting, settled. Whatever was going to happen, the building already knew it, and it was gathered around the knowing." He said the low resonance was already present when he arrived, already audible, which it had never been before the service. He said it was not alarming. He said it was the most natural sound he had ever heard in his life, and that he stood in the aisle and let it come up through the floorboards into his feet, and he was not afraid. He said he looked at the trapdoor. The trapdoor was in the northeast corner, where it had always been, and he said it was closed, and he said he did not go to it, and he said he did not want to. Not from fear. From the sense that what had been in that room below had come up. Not through the floor, not visibly, but that whatever it had been holding, whatever the writing in the stone had been holding for however long the stone had been there, had come up into the building, was in the air of the building that morning, and that there was no longer any reason to go down into the stone because the stone had released what it had been keeping. He prepared for the service. The congregation arrived between 8 and 8:30. They came the way rural people in bad weather always come, in their own time, not rushing, because hurrying on an icy gravel road in March in the hill country is a good way to end up in a ditch. They came in and sat down in their usual places, the 11 of them, spread through the 12 pews on each side. The building's resonance, which Gaddis had felt in the floor when he arrived, was now audible to everyone, and he knew it was audible because he watched their faces as they came in, and each face changed when they entered. Each one registered something, the way a face registers a sound it has been half expecting. Nobody mentioned it. That is the thing about these people, these 11 people, that I want you to understand. They had been watching and living with what was happening in that building for years. Not all of them knew the full extent of it, but all of them knew more than the people who had left. They had stayed precisely because they were people who could be with something unknown without immediately needing to define it or expel it. These were people who had decided, each in their own way, that whatever was in that building was not theirs to end. The service began. The singing came first, as it always did. They sang 3 hymns. Gaddis did not tell Doctor Stout which 3, and I have looked at other sources and cannot determine this with certainty, only that one of them was one of the old shape-note hymns that Calvary Rest had been singing since before any of them were alive. The extra verse happened in all 3. In the last hymn, the building's verse came before the congregation's verse, audibly, unmistakably. And the congregation sang theirs after it, one voice following the other, and at the end there was a moment of silence that Cressida Ogle described in the last entry of her last journal as the most complete silence she had ever heard in her life, because it was a silence in which both the congregation and the building had finished what they were saying and were waiting together. Then Gaddis stood at the pulpit for the reading. He said he opened his Bible to the text he had prepared. He said he looked at it. He said he stood there with the prepared text in front of him for a long time, long enough that the congregation had time to be aware that something was happening that was not normal, long enough that Cressida Ogle looked up from her lap where her own Bible was, long enough that Harriet Deal, who was in the front pew, said in her own later account that she had been aware of Gaddis standing very still at the pulpit and had wondered if he was unwell. He was not unwell, he said. I looked at my text, and I knew it was the wrong text. Not wrong in the sense of incorrect or sinful, wrong in the sense of insufficient. The text I had prepared was a good text, and I had had good reason to choose it, and on any other Sunday of my life I would have read it and preached it, and it would have served. But that morning, in that building, in the gathered quiet of what was in those walls, it was insufficient. It was too small for the morning. The morning required something else, and I knew it, and I did not know what it was. He said he stood at the pulpit, and he waited. He said the waiting was not the waiting of a man who is lost. He said it was the waiting of a man who is listening for something he has not heard yet and trusts he will hear. And he said that after a time that he could not estimate, he heard it, not as a voice from outside himself, as a knowing, as the way you sometimes know a thing you did not know you knew until you needed it. He said the building gave it to him. In the same way the building had been giving back verses for 98 years, one more than what was on the page, one step deeper. The building gave him the reading, he said. I read what the building gave me. I read it aloud, from the pulpit, to the 11 people in the pews, and I read it slowly, the way you read a thing you want people to be able to carry with them afterward. And then he said, and I will not tell you what it was. Dr. Stout's transcript records a pause of approximately 2 minutes here. She did not push him. She waited. He said, it was not Scripture, or not only Scripture. It was something that included Scripture the way a river includes the rain that falls into it. It was text from the walls below. It was the verses the congregation had been giving back to the building for 98 years, and the building had been adding to and giving back, and adding to, and the whole accumulation of it, every extra verse, every completed sentence, every name, all of it together, had become a text, and that text is what I read that morning. He said, and I cannot repeat it, because what I read is not mine to repeat. It belongs to that building. It belongs to that foundation. It belongs to whatever was in the stone before we were. I was the instrument of it that morning, not the author, and I have no right to take it out of the room where it was spoken and put it somewhere else. Then Dr. Stout asked him one question. She asked, "What did the 11 people do while you were reading?" And he said, "They listened. They were very still." They were the way people are when they are hearing something they have been waiting for, without knowing they were waiting. Some of them wept, not loudly, the way people weep when something resolves, when a long thing comes to its end. He said, "When I finished, I closed the Bible and I said the benediction, and then I said something I had not said in 23 years of services at that church. I said that we would not meet again, and nobody argued. Nobody asked why. I said it, and they knew it was true, the way they had known everything that morning was true without anyone explaining it." He said, "We went out. I was the last one out. I stood in the doorway for a moment, and I looked back at the room, the pews, the pulpit, the cross on the wall, the trap door in the northeast corner, and the building was the quietest it had ever been, and it was the most complete quiet I have ever heard, because it was a quiet that had arrived after a long time of not being quiet, and a quiet like that is not empty. It is full. It is full of everything that was said in it." He locked the door. He got in his truck and drove down the hollow, and he did not come back. The 11 people who had been in that room scattered, as I said, to 4 counties over the following 8 months. Not all at once, not in a panic. They left the way people leave a place where something has been completed, the way you leave a house you grew up in after the last of your parents is gone. The leaving is not a rejection of the place. It is a recognition that the place no longer needs you. Cressida Ogle moved to Chattanooga in the summer of 1961. Her journals end in March of that year. On the day of the last service, the final entry is one sentence. It has enough now. Hobart Gentry stayed in the hollow for another 7 years, until his death in 1968, and in those 7 years he did not go back to the bench. He said he had no reason to. He said the bench was fine without him. When he died, his nephew boarded the 2 windows that had been broken and filed the paperwork with the county, and that was the last official act of anyone connected to the congregation. Harriet Deal moved to Nashville in the fall of 1961. She is the source for the account of that morning's service that I have been working from, in part, the account she gave to Dr. Stout in 1987. She was 60 years old then, and she was clear in her recollections and precise in her language, and there is one thing she said that I want to give you now, at the end of this, because it is the thing I have thought about longest. Dr. Stout asked her whether she had been afraid that morning, in the service, listening to Gaddis read. Whether she had been afraid of what she was hearing. Harriet Deal said, "No." She said it without hesitation. Dr. Stout asked why not, and Harriet Deal said, "Because I knew the voice, not the words, the voice." And then she paused and she said, "Not like a person's voice, like the voice of a place. You know how some places have a quality to them, a quality that is specific to that place and not anywhere else, a quality you recognize when you are in it. That is what I mean. The reading that morning had the voice of that building in it, the 98-year voice of that building, and I had been sitting in that building every Sunday for years, and I knew that voice the way you know your home. And whatever it was reading it in a voice I had loved for years without knowing it was a voice. So, no, I was not afraid." She said, "I was grateful. I was the kind of grateful you feel when something long unspoken is finally said." Now, Orrin Gaddis lived until 1981, and in the last years of his life he lived quietly in Barton County, where he was born, in the house that had been his parents' house, and he did not preach, and he did not seek out company, and he was not a recluse, but he was a man who had arrived somewhere and was resting in it. He gave Dr. Stout his interview in 1983, 2 years after she thought he had died, because the death record in Landers County had an error in it that was corrected in '83, and she traced him through the correction. He was 83 years old when she sat in his kitchen. He was still tall, still wide through the chest, though the height and the breadth had softened with age. He gave her 3.5 hours and 4 cups of coffee and a piece of pound cake his neighbor had left him, and at the end of it, he said one thing that is not in the 41 pages of transcript, because she did not turn her recorder back on in time. She wrote it in the margin of the last page, by hand, in her own writing, with the note, "After the recorder was off," he said, "the building is still there. Whatever is in the foundation is still there. And whatever we put into those walls in 98 years of Sundays is still there. And the 3 things together are sufficient. They do not need anything more from us. But I think about them. Every night, I think about them. And I am glad we were there for the part we were there for." He died 6 months after the interview. He was 83 years old. His Bible was not found among his effects. His notebook, the one with the copied text from the walls of the room under the church, was found. It is in a filing box at the college in Cookville, in Dr. Stout's archive, and it is sealed by her instruction until 20 years after her death. She is still living, as of my research. I have not asked to see inside the box. I am not sure I would read it if I could. The building is still standing. I have seen photographs from 2019 that show it intact. The white clapboard faded to a pale gray, the metal roof on the spring house visible behind it, the windows boarded, the door still nailed. The spring ran for a visitor in June of 2019, a woman who went up there as part of a survey of abandoned religious structures, and she noted in her report that the spring was running on a Wednesday in June when there was no congregation and had not been one for 58 years. She noted it as a curiosity and did not comment further. The trapdoor is still in the northeast corner, as far as anyone knows. Nobody has been inside the building since the windows were boarded in 1968. The limestone foundation below the floor is still there, and whatever is in the stone, whatever has been in the stone since before the building, before the congregation, before anyone in that county can remember, has been there through everything I have described to you tonight. And it is there now, and it has been gathering, as Mabel Gentry said in 1870, toward something. What I do not know, what nobody knows, is whether the morning of March 9th, 1961, was the arrival of that something, whether the reading that Orrin Gaddis gave from the pulpit that morning, in the voice of the building's 98-year accumulation, was the completion, the thing the foundation had been building toward since before anyone could say when, or whether it was one more verse, one more step, one more thing added to the stone's long memory, to be given back at some future hour, in some future voice, to whoever is in that room when the building is ready to speak again. I do not know. What I know is this. There is a building on a bench above a hollow in eastern Tennessee, nailed shut since 1961, and the spring beside it still knows when to run, and the foundation below it still holds what the foundation holds, and the walls between them are full, as Harriet Deal said, of the 98-year voice of a place that learned to speak by listening. If you were the one who opened that door, if you were the one who walked into that room and sat in one of those worn pine pews and waited, would you be able to tell the difference between the silence of a room that was finished and the silence of a room that was waiting to begin again? Would you know, when the singing started, whether it was yours? Leave me your town in the comments. Leave me what you thought of this one. If you have a story about a place that knew your name, a building that held more than you brought into it, leave it below, and I will read every one. The next case is a school in the Ridge Country, 6 counties over from this one, with a register in the back room that the county never collected, and a desk in the last row that knows something the others do not. That one comes next. Keep the doors locked tonight. Let me go back. because I have left out the thing I most need to tell you, which is what the hollow itself was like to be in, and why the people who lived in it for generations developed the relationship with Calvary Rest that they did, and why 11 people who were not stupid and were not credulous stayed in a building that was doing what that building was doing, week after week, year after year, through the 1950s until the morning that ended it. Because I have been telling you about the building and the foundation and the spring and the extra verse, and those are real and those are the center of the case, but I have not told you what it was like to live in Weeping Hollow itself, and that life is what made those people who they were, and who they were is why they could do what they did. Weeping Hollow is not a hospitable piece of ground. The hollow floor is narrow, and the ridge walls rise steeply on both sides, and the light comes in at angles, morning light from the east for a few hours, and afternoon light from the west for a few hours, and the middle of the day in the hollow is a gray, filtered light that makes everything look slightly earlier or slightly later than it actually is. The growing season is shorter than the flat country below. The first frost comes a month early. The last frost lingers past what you would expect. The creek that runs the length of the hollow floods in March, and again sometimes in May, and every family who has ever tried to farm the bottom ground has lost to it eventually. The people who stayed in Weeping Hollow were not the people who had other options. That is a hard truth, and I mean it without contempt, because the people who stayed were the people who chose what they had, and the choosing made them something specific. They were people who knew how to be in a hard place and find what was good in it, and what was good in Weeping Hollow, what made it worth the narrow light and the short season and the flooding creek, was the bench above the spring, and on the bench, the building. That building was the warmest room in their lives. Not temperature warmth, the warmth of a room where you had always been known by name, where your name had been said aloud every week among the names of the people you loved, where the deaths and the marriages and the baptisms of every family you were kin to had been marked and witnessed and named. 81 years of that, by the time Gaddis arrived, and 23 more while he was there, and the warmth of it was a warmth that outlasted any particular loss, any particular cold season, any particular year when the creek took the bottom field. That is what those 11 people were holding on to in the years when the congregation dwindled. Not a superstition, not a habit, not a refusal to admit that things had changed. They were holding on to the only room in their lives that had ever known them completely, over time, the way time teaches knowing. And what the building was giving back to them in those years, the extra verse, the completed sentence, the resonance in the floor and the walls, was the building knowing them back. 98 years of being known by a congregation, and the building had learned the knowing, and it was returning it. You have to understand that to understand why they stayed. And you have to understand why they stayed to understand why the morning of March 9, 1961, was not a horror to them. It was a homecoming. But let me go back further than that. Let me go back to before Orrin Gaddis and even before the congregation that preceded him, because there is a thread in this case that runs back past all of them, and the thread is the hollow itself, and what the hollow was before the church. Landers County was settled in the 1790s, when the Scotch-Irish families from the Piedmont country of the Carolinas and Virginia came over the mountains looking for ground that was still available and willing to make do with what they found. Weeping Hollow was settled in 1806, or thereabouts, by a family named Ogle, which is the first of the names that will recur, and which is significant. The Ogles, who settled the hollow in 1806, are the family from which Cressida Ogle descended, which means the family that first walked into the hollow and found the bench above the spring and built a cabin on it, is the same family that one of the last members of Calvary Rest came from, and I do not think that is coincidence. I think the Ogle family had a particular relationship with that ground from the beginning, and I think Cressida Ogle knew it, and I think it is part of why she stayed. The hollow was called Weeping Hollow before the Ogles named it. That is, in the land survey of 1806, which describes the hollow as lying in a northeastward direction from a distinctive rock formation on the ridge, and which uses the name Weeping Hollow as though it were already a name rather than an invention, and which gives no explanation for the name. Land surveys in that period are practical documents. They note what is there. They use the names that are in use. If the survey of 1806 called it Weeping Hollow, then Weeping Hollow was what people were already calling it, which means the name predates the survey, which means the name was given by people who were in that territory before the 1806 settlement, which means Cherokee or earlier, and we have no record of what they knew about it or why they named it what they named it. And that gap is one of the places where I am willing to say, I do not know, and I mean it. What I can say is that the bench above the spring was, when the Ogle family arrived, already clear, already flat, already the obviously correct place to put a building, and the limestone at the base of the bench was already in courses, already fitted, already forming the square, tight-jointed walls of a room below the surface of the ground. Absalom Gentry found it when he was laying the foundation for the church in 1863, and he built on it because it was good, and because the times were pressing, and because a surveyor or a builder in that period would not have stopped to ask why a foundation was already there. He would have been grateful for it, and used it. The room below the church floor was not built by Absalom Gentry. It was not built by anyone who built anything in Landers County. It was there when the first white settlers arrived, and it was there when the Cherokee were in the territory, and whoever built it to last, because the limestone is fitted with a precision that speaks of patience and skill and time, and the room below the church floor has not shifted in the century and a half, that the building above it has been settling and resettling with the seasons. And the writing on the walls, the writing that Gaddis found on his first descent in 1956, and that had grown by his second descent in 1958, and that was glowing, faintly, blue-white on his third descent in 1959. He said in his account to Dr. Stout that the writing was in many hands, not 2 or 3, many, as though the room had received visitors over a very long time, each of whom had added something to what was already there, and the substance it was written in was not ink, and was not paint, and was not anything he could identify with certainty, but it was something that had been absorbed into the stone so deeply that it was the stone now, and removing the writing would require removing the wall. He said the hands were from different periods, different traditions of letter form, different systems of notation, not all of them the Roman alphabet, and some of them not alphabet at all, and that reading across the walls was like reading across centuries, which was what he was doing. He copied as much as he could. He said afterward that what he copied was a small fraction of what was there. He worked for 4 hours on that second visit, and he worked by lamplight in a crouch, because the ceiling was the underside of the floor, and the room was not built for a tall man to stand upright in, and at the end of 4 hours he had 3 pages of the notebook, and he had touched perhaps a sixth of the wall surface. He went home, and he sat with those 3 pages for the rest of 1958, and what he made of them, piece by piece, is in the sealed notebook in Dr. Stout's archive. But he gave Dr. Stout one piece of it directly. In the interview, he said, "There is a passage near the bottom of the east wall, near the floor, that I think is the oldest text in the room. The letter form is unlike anything I know how to date. But the passage, as best I can read it, and I cannot be confident of my reading, is about calling, about what it means to call a name in a place that knows how to hold a name, about what a name becomes when it has been called enough times in the same room that the room remembers it." He said, "In every tradition I know, there is a belief that the names of the dead, spoken aloud, keep the dead in some kind of relationship with the living, not alive, but not entirely absent. The name is the thread. The speaking of the name is the pulling of the thread. And a room where the same names are spoken aloud, week after week, in the same order, in the same ceremony, is a room full of threads. It is a room where the dead are kept very close by the living. He said, I think that room under the floor has been keeping what was called in the room above it for as long as anyone has been calling anything above it. And I think what was in the foundation before any of us got there was already doing the same thing, in its own way, before we arrived, and that what we did for 98 years above it gave it something it could work with. He said, I do not know if that is beautiful or frightening, and I stopped trying to decide around the time I turned 60. Now I want to tell you about Rupert Shambley, who was the preacher before the long gap before Orrin Gaddis, who left in 1911 for what the minutes called personal calling elsewhere, and about whom I have been holding back because his story is the one that illuminates everything, and I needed you to have the context before I gave it to you. Rupert Shambley came to Calvary Rest in 1908 from a congregation in Carter County, where he had served 8 years and left under circumstances that were described to me by a descendant of a Carter County church member as the kind of circumstances that nobody names directly, but that everyone understands, which description is one I have heard in enough contexts to know it means something happened that unsettled people and was not talked about, which is a description that fits what happened at Calvary Rest 3 years later when Shambley left. He was 36 years old when he arrived at Calvary Rest. He was described by the people who knew him as intense, which in that time and that place meant someone who took things seriously that other people kept light, and which is not necessarily a criticism. He preached hard sermons, and he visited the sick with genuine attention, and the congregation liked him, which makes what happened in 1911 more difficult to account for, because a congregation does not forget a preacher it liked, and nobody in Landers County in 1911 forgot what Rupert Shambley did. He did not leave. That is the thing. The minutes say personal calling elsewhere, because that is what the minutes were written to say, and it was not true. What Shambley did, on the second Sunday of October, 1911, was refuse to leave the building at the end of the service. Not dramatically. Not in a way that required anyone to force him out or manage a scene. He simply sat down in the front pew when the service ended, and he would not get up. And when the congregation asked him what was wrong, he said, nothing was wrong. And when they asked him to come home with them for Sunday dinner, he said he was staying. And when the deacons came back at 3 in the afternoon to check on him, he was still in the front pew. And he was in the same position when they came back at 6 in the evening. And he was there when Beulah Marsh, who was the closest thing to a neighbor the church had, came in the morning to find him. He had been in the building for 22 hours. He was not ill. He was not in distress. When Beulah Marsh asked him if he needed anything, he said no. When she asked him if he was going to leave, he said, not yet. When she asked him why, he said that he was listening to something and was not finished listening. She left him there. She came back the next morning, and he was still there, and she left again. He was in the building for 6 days, sitting in the front pew, and on the 6th day he got up, walked out, got in his wagon, and drove to Barton County, where he had a brother, and was never seen in Landers County again. The congregation never heard from him directly. They heard from his brother, 6 months later, that Shambley was well and was preaching again at a small church in Barton County, and that he sent his regards and was grateful for the kindness shown him. Nobody ever asked him, as far as any record shows, what he had been listening to for 6 days in the front pew of Calvary Rest. And Beulah Marsh, who was the only person who had been with him in those days, said one thing when she was asked, and then she said she would not speak of it again, and she did not. She said, he was hearing the whole of it, not a piece of it. The whole 98 years, all at once. And he could not leave until he had heard it all. Think about that. 98 years of Sundays compressed into 6 days of listening in a front pew in October, every name spoken at every roll call, every extra verse the building had ever returned, every resonance in the floor and the walls, every prayer and every song, and every benediction in the voice that a building develops when it has been holding the same content for a century. And then Orrin Gaddis arrived, 27 years later, and he held what was left of that congregation for 23 more years, and he listened to the building accumulate, and he went down into the room below 3 times, and on the morning of March 9th, 1961, he read from the pulpit what the building finally chose to say. The thing I keep coming back to, the thing I cannot put down, is the question of what the building was actually doing in all those years. Was it keeping the dead, as Gaddis suggested, holding the names of everyone who had ever been named in that room in proximity to the living? Was it accumulating something, building toward something, the way Mabel Gentry and Orrin Gaddis both sensed independently 100 years apart? Or was it doing something simpler and stranger than either of those things? Was it just listening, the way a very old and very patient thing listens, not in order to answer but in order to know, and knowing in order to hold, and holding because holding is what it is, because the limestone has been fitted and the spring has been running and the bench has been level for longer than anyone has record of, and what goes into such a place does not evaporate. It goes into the stone. When Gaddis stood at the pulpit on the morning of March 9th, 1961, and read what the building gave him to read, he was reading back the total of what had been said in that room since 1863. Every prayer and every hymn and every name and every benediction and every extra verse synthesized by the stone into a text that was all of them at once, that was the voice of a congregation speaking across its own full lifetime. And it ended things, Harriet Deal said, not because the building had run out, but because it had finished. Not all things end because they are exhausted. Some things end because they are complete. I have spent a long time with this case, longer than any other I have worked on. I have sat with the church records and the journals and the transcripts and the deed books, and I have driven through Landers County on a wet afternoon in November, and sat in my car at the foot of the hollow road and looked up into the trees, and I have not gone up. I made that choice deliberately, and I feel the rightness of it, because some things are better kept than visited. Mabel Gentry said so in 1870 in different words. The building is complete. It has enough. Going up there would be bringing something it already has more of than it needs, which is the living voice, the living question, the living desire to know. And knowing has a cost. Rupert Chambly sat in that pew for 6 days because he could not stop listening. Orrin Gaddis was awake for the last 19 years of his life, thinking about what he read from the pulpit. 2 members of the congregation never spoke the name of the hollow again. The building is generous with what it holds. It is not dangerous. I do not think it wishes anyone ill, but what it holds is complete, and it is old, and it is not organized around the needs of the living, because the living were only ever a portion of what it was built to hold. It holds the dead by name. It has held them by name for 160 years. And whatever the foundation held before that, whatever went into the stone before Absalom Gentry built his building on top of it, it held it longer than that, and with the same patience and in the same darkness. And when Orrin Gaddis read the final text on the morning of March 9, 1961, and locked the door behind him, he did not lock the building against the living. He locked it with the understanding, confirmed by the building itself, that the building no longer required them. It was full. It was gathered. It had arrived at what it had been building toward, and it was holding it as it holds everything in the stone. One last thing. Cressida Ogle, in her final journal entry, wrote only 5 words, as I told you. It has enough now. But she wrote a longer entry earlier that same morning, before the service, in the hours before she drove up the hollow for the last time, and she did not number this entry or date it, which is unusual for her, and it reads as follows. She wrote, "The last thing I need to say in this book is that I do not think what is in that building is God, and I do not think what is in that building is anything I would have a word for from any tradition I know, and I am not afraid of that, because I have sat in that room for 44 years, and I know its quality. I know it the way you know a person's quality, and whatever it is not malicious, and it is not indifferent. It is something that has been paying extremely close attention for a very long time, and paying close attention to people is the closest thing to love that most of us ever get. So, whatever it is, I am not afraid of it, and I am glad it will still be there after we are gone. I am glad something will remember our names. I think about those words more than anything else I have read in this whole account. I am glad something will remember our names, said in the morning before the last service, in full knowledge of what the building was and what it held, by a woman who had chosen it year after year for 44 years. 81 years of a congregation going into a building and saying their names, and the building remembering. Have you ever sat in a room and felt that the room knew you were there? Not the people in it, the room itself. The walls and the floor and the air that the room had been making out of the same collected breath for years. Have you ever felt that kind of attention from a place and had to decide what to name it? And if you knew that in a hollow in eastern Tennessee, in a building nailed shut since 1961, there was a room under the floor with your name in it, written in the stone, held in the stone, alongside the names of everyone who had ever spoken in that room above it, would you want to go there? Would you want to know that something had been paying that close attention to everyone who had ever lived in that hollow, and gone to that building on Sunday morning and offered their voice to the air? Or is there some small and necessary relief in the idea that something keeps, that the names go somewhere, that the voice, said often enough in a room that knows how to hold, does not disappear when the voice does? I don't have an answer to that. I know what Cressida Ogle decided, and I know what Orrin Gaddis decided, and I know what the 11 people who were in that room on the morning of March 9th, 1961 decided, and I know that all of them decided without hesitation, which is the most anyone can say about a decision like that. Leave me what you decided in the comments. I read every one. And keep your own name close tonight. Say it out loud before you sleep, if you are the kind who wants to make sure something heard it. Sleep well, if you can. Now, let me go back and fill in the spaces I moved through too quickly, because the shape of a case like this is not built in the big events. It is built in the small ones, the ones that happen in the margins of the weeks between the Sundays, in the kitchens and the road edges, and the long drives and the afternoons that do not appear in any official record. The years between 1938, when Gaddis arrived, and 1956, when the spring changed, are 18 years, and I have been treating them as a prologue, as the quiet before the thing begins. But those 18 years are not nothing. Those 18 years are the foundation of what Orrin Gaddis was when the thing began, and the foundation of what the congregation was, and without them, none of the rest of it makes the sense it makes. Gaddis arrived in the fall of 1938. The Depression was not finished. It was in its 9th year, and the Hollow families were in it like everyone else in the hill country. And the congregation at Calvary Rest was not the congregation it would become, or rather, it was the congregation it would become, but stripped down to the bone of itself, with everything inessential already shed. What was left at Calvary Rest in 1938 was the people who could not be induced to leave by hardship, which is to say, the people who were held there by something other than prosperity. He preached his first sermon on the first Sunday of October, 1938, and Cressida Ogle was in the 4th pew on the left side, where she always sat and where she had been sitting since 1916, and where she would sit for another 23 years. She wrote about that first Sunday in her journal. She wrote, "The new preacher is a large man with large hands and a careful way of speaking. And his first sermon was about water, about the verse where the voice of the Lord is like the sound of many waters. And when he said, 'many waters,' his voice changed in a way that told me he was not speaking from certainty. He was speaking from need. He is a man who needs what he is preaching toward, which in my experience is usually a better preacher than a man who has already arrived." That is Cressida Ogle at 41, assessing a preacher in the first hour of their acquaintance and being precisely right. He did need it, he told Doctor Stout, that when he arrived at Calvary Rest, he was a man who had been preaching at things for 13 years and had not yet understood that the direction of the preaching was the problem. He said, "I was preaching outward, at the congregation, at the condition of the world, at the texts, at everything external to the act of preaching. I had not yet learned to preach inward, which is the only kind of preaching that matters, because the only thing a sermon can do that a lecture cannot is go somewhere the text cannot take you alone." He said, "I learned that in that building, and I learned it slowly, and I learned it because the building did not let me preach outward. You cannot preach outward in a room that is listening back. The room corrects you, not harshly, the way a very good teacher corrects, by reflecting back what you actually said rather than what you meant to say." Those 18 years, from 1938 to 1956, were the years he learned to preach inward, Sunday by Sunday, sermon by sermon, in a room that was listening back and returning what it heard. And what he learned in those years was woven into him so thoroughly that by the time the spring changed and the sound returned and the extra verse became something more than an extension, he was ready for it in a way that no other preacher in the history of that building had been ready. He had been trained by the building itself. Now I want to tell you about the DeWitt family, because the DeWitt family is the gap in the congregation's story that nobody has written about, and that is the most important gap. In the years between 1945 and 1951, the 6 years immediately after the war, Calvary Rest had its largest congregation since the turn of the century, 43 members at the peak in 1948. The reason was the DeWitt family. The DeWitts were a family who came to the Hollow in the fall of 1945 from Harlan County, Kentucky, which was coal country, which was a place a lot of people were leaving in those years. There were 2 DeWitt brothers, Millard and Fate, and between them and their families there were 11 people. And when they came with 4 other Harlan County families who had traveled with them, and the combined arrival more than doubled the Calvary Rest congregation in 1 month. The reasons they chose Weeping Hollow were the reasons people choose remote places after terrible years. They wanted quiet. They wanted land and a community and a place where nobody was going to come and tell them things had changed. They were not people who needed the world to be different from what it was. They were people who needed a place that would stay what it was, which is a need that the Hollow, in a different way than they expected, was very good at meeting. Millard DeWitt was the dominant personality of the 2 brothers, and he was the one Gaddis dealt with most directly. He was a big man, as Gaddis was big, and he was accustomed to being the person in a room who set the direction of things, and his arrival changed the dynamic of the Calvary Rest congregation in ways that Gaddis found useful at first and troubling later. What Millard DeWitt brought to Calvary Rest was organization. Not financial organization, though that too. He brought the organization of expectation. He expected things to happen in a certain way, and he was persuasive about that expectation. And the congregation, which had been drifting in the gentle, self-directed way of long-established small communities, found itself in the middle of a decade of programs and improvement projects and schedules and expectations of the kind that a larger congregation would have had by necessity, and that a small one acquires only when someone with Millard, DeWitt's particular quality of drive comes into it, and the building resisted. That is the word Gaddis used. He said, "The building resisted." He did not mean it fought. He did not mean anything dramatic. He meant that in the years when the DeWitts and their families were the majority of the congregation, the extra verse stopped. The resonance in the floor was absent. The spring ran normally, at its normal temperature, without the quality of knowing that Hobart gentry had first noticed. The building went quiet in the way a person goes quiet in company they are not sure of. Gaddis was careful to say that this was his interpretation, and that another interpretation was simply that those years were good years, full years, years when the congregation was large enough that its own sounds filled the room and drowned out whatever the room itself was doing. He said, "I genuinely do not know if the building withdrew or if I was simply not able to hear it through the noise of 43 people." But he noticed its return. When the DeWitts left, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, as the coal industry in the flat country recovered and the economic reasons for being in the hollow diminished, when they left over 3 years in ones and twos, until by 1952 the congregation was back to 31, the same number it had been when Gaddis arrived, the building came back. The extra verse returned first. Then the quality in the spring. Then the low resonance in the floor during the services. And Gaddis, who was in his early 50s by then, and had been in that building for 15 years and knew its rhythms better than anyone, recognized the return immediately and was more relieved than he expected to be. He wrote about it, not in the church record, but in a personal letter to a seminary classmate that survives in the classmate's family papers, and that I have seen a copy of. He wrote, "The building is back, and I am embarrassed to tell you how much I missed it, because I know how that sounds, and I can already hear your response. But a preacher who has gotten used to a room that preaches back is a lost man in a room that does not." I did not know what to do with the silence. I thought for 3 years that I had gotten worse at my work, and what had actually happened was that the work had returned to being only mine, and only mine is not as good. He said, "Whatever is in this building, it makes better preachers. That is its function, I have come to believe. That is what the accumulation of all those years of prayer and singing is for. It has built, in the walls and in the foundation, a kind of listener, and a listener like that changes what you say." That letter is dated 1952, 4 years before the spring changed, 4 years before the sound returned in a different key, 4 years before everything I have been describing to you shifted into its final register. And what it shows is Gaddis already aware, already thinking in terms that the rest of the decade would clarify into something urgent. Let me tell you about Dr. Lavinia Stout, because her presence in this case is not just methodological, she is a character in it, the same way Mabel Gentry is a character in it, the same way Cressida Ogle is a character, and her character illuminates something about the case that the case cannot say about itself. She was a professor of regional studies at a small college in Cookeville, Tennessee, which is in the central part of the state and not so far from Landers County as to be a stranger's distance. She was born in 1942 in Cumberland County, which is the county directly west of Landers, and she grew up in a household with what she described in her own writings as a complicated relationship to the folk traditions of the Plateau country, meaning she was raised inside them and educated out of them, and spent her career trying to find a way to be in both places simultaneously. She came to this case from the outside, as an oral historian documenting the closure of small rural churches, and what she found when she started following the thread of Calvary Rest was something that required her to be larger than the methodology she had brought with her. She told an interviewer in 1990 that collecting the Calvary Rest materials had changed her relationship to what her work was for, that she had come to it thinking documentation was a way of preserving, and discovered that in this case, documentation was a way of participating, that the case was not finished when the doors were locked, that it was still going on in the testimony of the people who had been there, and that recording that testimony was an extension of what the building itself had been doing, which was holding what was said to it. She said, "I am a person who writes things down, and the building is a place that holds things said. And I am not sure, at this point in my life, that those are different activities." She is still living, as of my knowledge, in Cookville. She is in her 80s. She has never published the Calvary Rest materials, not in full. She has described the case in general terms in 2 essays and in a chapter of a book about sacred spaces in Appalachian culture, and she has said that she intends to publish the full transcript and archive after her death, and that her instructions regarding the sealed notebook with Gaddis's copied text from the walls are clear and will be followed. I respect that. I respect it because she is the one who did the work, and she has made a judgment about the right timing of the full disclosure, and she has reasons I can guess at, and I think her guess about the timing is probably correct. But there is one thing she published, in the essay she wrote in 1994, that I want to give you because it is the clearest statement of the central question of this case that anyone has made in any of the sources. She wrote, "The question that Calvary Rest poses, and that I have never been able to answer to my own satisfaction, is whether what accumulated in that building over 98 years was the residue of the congregation's faith, a kind of spiritual sediment, or whether it was something that was already in the foundation before the congregation arrived, something old and patient and specific to that place, that the congregation's practice of naming and singing simply activated, fed, made into what it needed to become. Whether the congregation made what the building held, in other words, or whether the building made the congregation into the instrument of what it already intended to hold." She wrote, "I lean toward the latter, and I lean toward it because of one fact that I have not been able to explain away, which is that the building was different, measurably and consistently different in its sonic and atmospheric properties during the DeWitt years, when the congregation was largest and most vigorous, than it was during the years before and after, when the congregation was smaller and more settled. A room that diminishes in its most notable qualities when it is fullest of people, and that intensifies those qualities when the congregation is small and long-tenured, is not a room that runs on the energy of the people in it. It is a room that runs on something else, and the people in it are its medium, not its source. The congregation was its medium, not its source. That is the sentence I keep returning to. The congregation was the medium through which the building did what it was doing, and what it was doing was something that had been started before any of them arrived, in the stone, in the dark, in the fitted limestone of a room whose builders nobody in Landers County could name, and the congregation participated willingly. Not without awareness, not without sometimes being frightened, or sometimes being confused, or sometimes being moved to leave, because what was happening in that building was more than they had bargained for when they came for a Sunday service in a small white church on a bench above a spring, but willingly, because the building gave them what it gave them, and what it gave them was the sense of being held in a continuity longer than their own lives, of being part of something that was not done with them even when their own stories were done with themselves. That is a gift. It is a particular and rare gift, and the 11 people who stayed until the end were the ones who had received it completely, who had understood what it was and had accepted it on its own terms, and who walked out of that building on the morning of March 9th, 1961, not abandoned, but released, not bereft, but finished, each of them carrying the knowledge of what had been said in that room for 100 years, and of what it had cost and what it had given, and each of them keeping that knowledge the way you keep something that is not yours to share, not because it is shameful, but because it is complete in itself, and does not need to be extended. Harriet Deal lived until 2007. She was 80 years old. In the last years of her life, she lived in Nashville, where she had moved in the fall of 1961, and where she had made a life that had nothing to do with Weeping Hollow except in the foundation of herself, which the Hollow had built without her knowing it was building it. Over the years, she had driven up that gravel road on Sunday mornings. She was a clear-eyed woman in old age. Her testimony to Dr. Stout, when she gave it in 1987, was so clear that Dr. Stout said in her notes that it was the clearest account of any event she had ever been given in 30 years of oral history work, and that the clarity was not the clarity of a practiced storyteller, but the clarity of someone who had spent 26 years thinking about a morning and had arrived at absolute precision. One thing Harriet Deal said that is not in the formal transcript, that is, in Dr. Stout's field notes rather than the typed record, is about the space after the reading. She said, "When he stopped reading, and before he said the benediction, there was a silence, and in the silence the building sang. Not words, not a verse, just the sound. The low resonance, the sound that had been building in the floor and the walls for years, filling the air of the room the way breath fills a body when you take a deep breath at the end of a long climb. The building sang. For a time she could not estimate, and she said the 11 of them sat and listened to it, and it sounded like completion, and it sounded like gratitude, and it sounded like something very old, very patient, very full of what it had been given, finding the voice for it at last. And then the resonance faded, and Gaddis said the benediction, and they went out, and the spring was still running as they came down the bench, and it was cold, and it was a bright March morning, and the hollow looked the way hollows look in early March, when the light comes in at angles through the bare trees, that particular filtered grace of a season that has not yet decided what it is going to be. They went to their cars and their trucks. They did not stand in the churchyard and talk, the way congregations do after services. They did not linger, Harriet Deal said. They went to their vehicles the way you leave a place where something has just been said that you need to hold quietly, without being asked to account for it yet. Gaddis was the last one out. She watched him from her truck. She said he stood in the doorway for longer than seemed necessary, and she could see him looking at the room behind him, and then he pulled the door to, and she heard the key in the lock, and he walked down the steps to his truck. And he did not look back, she said. He looked like a man who had just done the last thing he was there to do. And she said, I think he had. Now, the building, it is there. It is real. If you drove to Landers County, Tennessee, and found the hollow road, and drove 2.5 miles to where the road ends at the bench, and climbed the slope to the flat ground above the spring, you would find it. White clapboard gone pale gray, metal roof on the spring house, windows boarded, door nailed. The spring runs when it runs, and below the floor of the building, in the northeast corner, accessible through a trapdoor that is still on its hinges, is a room of fitted limestone, 8 feet by 8 feet, with writing on the walls that has been accumulating for longer than the building above it has existed, and that holds, in the substance it is written in the stone it has been absorbed into, the names of everyone who was ever named in the room above, including the names of 11 people on the morning of March 9th, 1961, including the name of Orrin Gaddis, said aloud in that room for the last time at the end of the benediction of the last service, when he said, as he always said, May the God of peace be with you all, and Harriet Deal, and Cressida Ogle, and Hobart Gentry, and Dale, and Noreen Stringer, and Burl, and Calvin Howell, and Ida Merrill, and Thurman Prater, and Roy and Glenna Fane, all said Amen in their various voices, and the building held all of it, and it is holding it still. What do you do with a building like that? What do you do with the knowledge that a room exists in the world where your name, if you had ever been in it to speak it, would be held in the stone. I think you leave it alone. I think you do what the county has been doing for 60 years, which is find a reason to table the decision about what to do with it, and then find another reason and let it stand. Mabel Gentry was right. Some things are better kept than visited. The building is keeping what it has, and what it has is complete, and it is old, and it does not need anything from us, and we cannot give it what we do not have, which is another 100 years. But it is there, and the spring is there, and the room below the floor is there, with the writing on the walls, and the writing is warm, and it glows faintly in the dark, and it remembers everything that was ever said in the room above it. And if you said your name out loud in the right place at the right time, in the right company, in the right building, on the right morning, it would hold that too, whether or not you ever came back to hear it. I told you at the beginning that there was a fifth body of material and that I would describe it when we got there. We are there now. The fifth body of material is not, technically, a document. It is more accurate to say it is a practice, a ritual practice that Orrin Gaddis maintained from the day he left Calvary Rest in the spring of 1961 until the day he died in 1981, 20 years, and that the people who knew him in those years observed without understanding until after his death, when the note was found. The note was in the Bible, not his mother's Bible, the red-letter King James that was lost. A different Bible, a plain one he had acquired some time after leaving the Hollow, with no inscription, no name on the flyleaf, nothing to identify whose it had been before him. The note was folded into the book of Psalms, between the pages, a single sheet of paper in his handwriting, undated. The note described a practice. The note said that every evening, before sleep, he said the names. And it described which names, and in which order, and what to say between them. The names were the members of the Calvary Rest congregation, all of them, going back to the founding in 1863, every member whose name was in the church record in the order they had joined, from the 12 founding families through to Roy and Glenna Fane. It was a long list. It took a considerable time to say every evening. The note did not say how long, but a reasonable estimate, given the membership history and the pace of saying names with attention, is somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. He said those names every night for 20 years. He did not tell anyone he was doing it. His neighbor, a woman who looked in on him regularly in his last years, said she sometimes heard him through the screen door on summer evenings, a steady, low murmur that she had assumed was prayer, which was not wrong. She said it was not the rhythm of Scripture or of the Lord's Prayer, or of any structured prayer she knew. It was the rhythm of a list. Name and pause. Name and pause. After his death, after the note was found in the Bible, she understood. He had taken the roll. Every night for 20 years, in his house in Barton County, he had taken the roll of Calvary Rest congregation the way he had stood at the pulpit and listened to Emmett Sparrow's instruction, the way the teachers of the school in West Virginia had taken the roll, name by name, and waited for the answer either way. Not because he expected an answer. He was a practical man, as I have told you. He had spent his life in the company of the dead, and he understood what the dead are and what they are not. He did not think the names he called would answer from wherever they had gone. He said the names because the saying of a name in the right spirit is an act of attention, and attention is the form that love takes when there is nothing else left to do. He was keeping the congregation in the only way he had left to keep it, outside the building, outside the stone, in his own voice on his own evenings. He was the preacher, and the congregation had been his responsibility for 23 years, and when the building released them and they scattered, he understood that the responsibility did not end with the congregation's dispersal. It moved. It came home with him. 20 years of names. Every night. Dr. Stout was given the note by the neighbor when she learned of its existence in the course of her research, and the note is in the Cookeville archive with the other materials. She wrote about it in the 1994 essay in a single paragraph at the end. She wrote, "The most important thing I found in the course of this work is also the smallest thing, and I have thought for several years about whether to include it in any public account because it feels like the private act of a private man that was not meant to be observed. But it also feels like the answer to the question I have been asking since I first drove up that hollow road, which is what you do when a building that has been holding your congregation lets it go. What do you do with the people you were responsible for when the place that was holding them releases them?" She wrote, "Orrin Gaddis took them home with him. He carried them in his mouth for 20 years. He said their names out loud, in the same order, every evening, because a name said aloud is a name that is alive in the world, however briefly, however quietly, in however small a room, and he believed, I think, that as long as he was saying them, they were not entirely gone, and that as long as they were not entirely gone, he was still, in some sense, their preacher." She wrote, "I think he was right, and I think she is right that he was right, and I think the building would agree. But here is the thing I have not told you yet, the thing that is in the note, but that doctor. Stout does not mention in the essay, and that I will not speculate about too directly, because to speculate about it too directly would be to say more than I know. The note includes, at the bottom, after all the instructions about the names and the order and what to say between them, a final line that is separate from the rest, written in what appears, based on the photocopy I have seen, to be a slightly different pressure as though added at a different time. The final line says, 'And at the end, listen, that is all. And at the end, listen.' He said the names, all of them, every night for 20 years, in the order they were listed in the church record, and at the end of the list, at the end of the 20 or 30 minutes of saying names in a quiet house in Barton County, he listened. I do not know what he heard. He wrote nothing about that. The note does not say. Dr. Stout does not speculate. The neighbor did not report anything unusual, though she also reported not having been in the room during the naming, only having heard it through the screen. I do not know what he heard. I do not know if he heard anything at all. I do not know if what he was doing was maintaining a connection to a place and a community in the only way available to him, or whether the building, even at the distance of 130 miles, even without the stone and the spring and the fitted limestone room below the floor, could receive what he was sending to it every night and send something back. I do not know. What I know is that he did it for 20 years without stopping. Every night, until he died in his bed in Barton County in the fall of 1981 at 81 years old, with the plain Bible on the nightstand and the note still folded in the Psalms, and the last thing he did every night before he slept being to listen in the silence of his own house, at the end of a list of names, for whatever might come back. There is a kind of faithfulness in that which has no name I know, not religious faithfulness, or not only that, the faithfulness of a person who understands that being responsible for others does not end when the occasion for responsibility ends. The faithfulness of a person who knows that the names we carry are not metaphors for anything. They are the people themselves, held in the only form we have to hold them after everything else is gone. Orrin Wesley Gaddis, born 1900, died 1981. Preacher, Calvary Rest Congregational Church, Weeping Hollow, Landers County, Tennessee. From 1938 to 1961, he is buried in Barton County, in a small churchyard, in a church he was never the preacher of, because the church he was the preacher of is closed. His marker says, "He kept faith." It does not specify with what. That is how it should be. Now I want to come back to the building one more time, because I have been circling around a question this whole evening that I have not asked directly, and I want to ask it now, before the end, because the asking is the point. The question is this: what was the reading? Not what Gaddis told Dr. Stout about it, which I have given you. Not what Harriet Deal described from the pew. Not what Cressida Ogle wrote in her last entry. What were the actual words? What did Orrin Gaddis stand at the pulpit of Calvary Rest on the morning of March 9, 1961, and read aloud to 11 people in a building that had been building toward that morning for 98 years? I said at the beginning of this that I would tell you. I said I would not do what these stories usually do, which is build for 3 hours and then shrug at the end, and I am going to keep that promise, but I am going to keep it in the way that is honest, which is to tell you what I know and be clear about the edges of that knowing. What I know is that the reading came from the building, that it was not Scripture alone, and not the extra verses alone, and not the text from the walls of the room below alone, but all of those things together synthesized. 98 years of a congregation speaking in a room, and the room giving it back. What I know is that Gaddis read it slowly, and that 11 people listened, and some of them wept, and that when he finished, the building sang. What I know is that Harriet Deal said it was in the voice of a place, the 98-year voice of a place, reading itself. What I know is that Gaddis told Dr. Stout he would not repeat it, and I believe that refusal was not secrecy. It was accuracy. To repeat what was read in that room would require the room, would require the stone and the spring and the years and the accumulated names, would require being in that building on that morning, would require everything that built up to the reading in order for the reading to mean what it means. Without all of that, it is only words. And words, without the room they were said in, and the years that said them, and the stone that held them, are only words. What I can tell you is this: the reading was about names, about what it means to speak a name in a place that holds names, about the relationship between the living and the dead, when the medium between them is a room that has learned to remember, about the long patience of stone, about what accumulates when faith and grief and ordinary Sunday morning love are poured into a single place, week after week, decade after decade, until the place is full. It was about what it means to be held by something that is not made of the same material as you are. The congregation was flesh and bone and voice, and they will all be gone eventually, and many of them are gone already, and the building is wood and stone, and it will stand longer than any of them, and the foundation is limestone, and it will stand longer than the building, and what is in the foundation will outlast the limestone itself. The reading was about that relationship, about the asymmetry of it, about what it means to offer your voice to something that will still be holding your voice long after you are silent. And it was about the fact that this is not terrifying. That is the part of it that Harriet Deal conveyed most clearly in her description of sitting in that pew and not being afraid. The reading said that it is not terrifying to be held by something older and more durable than yourself. It said that this is, in fact, the condition of every life, that every life is held by things it did not make and will not outlast, and that the particular version of that condition, which was the congregation of Calvary Rest in a hollow in eastern Tennessee, was just a more explicit and more intimate version of what is true everywhere. The reading said that the names in the stone are not trapped there. They are kept there. And kept is not the same as trapped. Kept is what happens when something takes you seriously enough to hold you. The reading said that, or so I believe, based on what the people who heard it have told us, and on what the building built up to over 98 years, and on what Mabel Gentry suspected in 1870, and on what Orrin Gaddis kept faith with for 20 years after. I cannot prove any of this. I have 5 bodies of material, and none of them contain the text of the reading. The text is in the sealed notebook in Cookville, if it is anywhere. The text is in the walls of the room below the floor of Calvary Rest, in the limestone, in the dark, where it has been since before the building. And the text is in the stone of that hollow, which is where it always was and where it will be when everything else is gone. That is all I know. That is everything I know. Have you ever been in a room where you felt that what had been said in it over a long time was still present in the air of it, not as sound but as quality, as the particular quality of a room that has been used for something specific for long enough that the using has become the room? Have you ever felt that a place was not just the sum of what happened in it, but was changed by the happening, the way a person is changed by the years of their life, and that what the place had been changed into was more than you had words for? Have you ever sat still in a building and had the building speak, not in a voice you could hear with your ears, but in the way a quality of light changes or the temperature shifts or the silence has a texture it did not have when you came in? If you have had that experience in any building, in any room, in any place that had been the site of enough human presence for long enough, leave it in the comments. I am not asking you to explain it. I am asking you to name it. Just the place, just the building, just the hollow or the church or the school or the house, just the name of the thing that knew you were there. Because naming is the act. The name said aloud is the name that is alive, however briefly, in whatever room you say it in. And I want to know what you have been in the presence of, and I want to say those names back in this space, which is a room of a different kind, where what is said is also held, in a different stone, for a different duration. The next case is a school, a 2-room school on a bench above a creek in West Virginia, with an attendance register in the back room and a desk in the last row that knows something about cold. That one comes next, and it is stranger than this one, and it is true in the same way this one is true. Find me in the comments. Tell me where you are. Tell me what you have been in the presence of. And bar the door tonight, not from fear, but from respect. Some things deserve the night to themselves. Before I let you go, I want to take you back into the texture of those years one more time. Not the big events, but the ordinary Sundays, the ones that did not make anyone's list of the things that happened, but that were the medium through which everything else moved. Because the horror of this story, and it is a horror, even if it is a gentle one, is not in any single event. It is in the accumulation, and accumulation is made of ordinary things. A Sunday in February of 1942. Not a significant date by any measure, not a date anyone in the story recorded or remembered afterward. The congregation is smaller than it will be when the DeWitts arrive, and larger than it will be at the end. There are 26 people in the pews. Outside, it is a wet, gray, cold day, the kind of February day that the plateau country produces in quantities, a day that is neither snow nor rain, but the miserable, indeterminate thing between them, a day that makes staying inside feel like wisdom rather than choice. Gaddis drives up the hollow in the dark, as he always does. He builds the fire in the back stove. He walks the room. The building in February of 1942 is quiet, ordinarily quiet, the quiet of a room that is waiting for the people who give it its weekly occasion. He stands at the pulpit for a moment before he goes back to the vestibule to wait, and he puts both hands on the wood, as he does every Sunday, and he feels the grain of it under his palms, the same wood he has touched every Sunday for 4 years. And the wood is familiar to him the way the handshake of an old friend is familiar. Not just the pressure, but the particular quality of that person's hand. He told Dr. Stout about this. He told her that in those middle years, the years before the spring changed, the relationship between him and the building was the relationship of a person and a room they have lived in long enough that the room has become an extension of themselves. He said, "I knew every sound that building made. I knew which board cracked when the temperature dropped below a certain point. I knew how the light came through the east windows in October, compared to April. I knew how the building breathed in summer, when the windows were open and the air moved through it, and how it breathed in winter, closed up with the stove going. I knew it the way you know a body you have lived in for a long time, which is not that you have memorized it, but that you have stopped noticing the separation between it and you. And he said, when things began to change in 1956, I knew it as immediately as you know when a body you are used to begins to behave differently. Not alarmingly, just differently. The way you know your own heartbeat, and so you know immediately when it changes. I did not need to think about it. I knew it was different before I could have told you how. 26 people on a February Sunday in 1942. They come in from the cold, shaking the wet off their coats, the children quieted by the stove and by the particular hush that buildings like that produce in people who have been raised in them. There is a quality of a certain kind of church building, old and plain and specific to one community for long enough, that produces a certain kind of quiet in the people who enter it, and it is not the quiet of suppression, not the quiet of being hushed by an authority. It is the quiet of recognition, the quiet of coming into a room that knows you. They sing 3 hymns. The building gives back the extra verse on the third one, as it has been doing for as long as anyone present can remember, and the extra verse is about winter, about the patience of cold things waiting for the turn, about something held in the ground that is not dead, but dormant. And the 26 people in the pews sing it without looking up from their hymnals, because there are no hymnals that contain that verse, which means they are singing it from the room itself, from what the room has taught them over years of Sundays. And they do not find this remarkable because it has always been so. Gaddis preaches about patience. He preaches it because it is February, and because the congregation needs it, and because he has been in that hollow long enough to know what February requires of the people who live in it. He preaches about the patience of seeds in cold ground, about the long preparation for something that has not arrived yet, about trust as a form of patience rather than as a form of certainty. He preaches it from the text of the Psalms, from the one about waiting for the Lord as the watchmen wait for the morning, and the congregation follows him into it, the way a congregation follows a good sermon into its own interior, each of them finding in the words the particular version of the patience they most need. And at some point in the middle of the sermon, in the low and ordinary February afternoon of the middle of a service in a church that nobody outside that hollow would have known existed, something passes through the room. Not a visible thing, not a sound, a quality. The quality of being paid attention to. The quality of a room that is listening with interest rather than simply resonating, the way a conversation partner leans forward slightly when the thing being said is the right thing, and the room leans forward, and 26 people feel it in different ways, but all of them feel it, and nobody mentions it. And Gaddis goes on preaching. He knew. He told Dr. Stout he knew it had happened, knew it the moment it happened, and that he went on preaching because going on was the right response. He said, "A room paying attention to you is the best reason in the world to say what you came to say. I was not going to squander it by stopping." He said, "I preached the best version of that sermon I had in me, and the room received it. And when I was done, the room was fuller than when I started. Not with people. It was the same 26 people. Fuller with something else, with what had been said, with what had been said. That is the engine, and he understood it from the beginning, even before the spring changed, even before the things that happened in 1956, the room filled with what was said in it. He knew that was true. He did not know the extent of it yet. He did not know what fullness meant, not yet. But he knew the room filled. And he knew that preaching into a full room was different from preaching into an empty one, and he knew that whatever was filling it was not the work of anyone in the congregation. It was older than the congregation. Let me tell you about Hobart Gentry, because I have mentioned him several times, and I want to give him the attention he deserves, because he is one of the people who stayed until the end, and his reasons for staying are different from Cressida Ogle's and different from Harriet Deal's. And understanding those different reasons tells you something about what the building was offering to the people in it. Hobart Gentry was the great-nephew of Absalom Gentry, who built the building. He was born in 1891, and he was 70 years old on the morning of March 9, 1961. He had been attending services at Calvary Rest his entire life, every Sunday of his life that he was not too ill to attend or too far from home to travel, and there were not many of either. He was a man of the hollow, the way trees are of the ground they grow in, not because he was rooted in the conventional sense, but because the hollow was the material his personality had been shaped by, and he had never sought any other shape. He was not a complicated man, and I do not mean that as diminishment. He was a farmer, a widower, a man who worked hard and kept his word and had a gift for the spring, as I said, which meant he was the one most attuned to the changes there and who reported them to Gaddis, because Gaddis was the person he trusted with the things he could not account for. He had one conversation with Gaddis that Gaddis reported at length to Dr. Stout, and that I want to give you, because it is Hobart Gentry's philosophy in 4 or 5 sentences, and his philosophy is why he stayed. They were sitting on the front steps of the church in the fall of 1958, between the second and third descents, after the Sunday service. In the good light of an October afternoon, most of the congregation had gone down the lane. It was just the two of them, and it was the kind of afternoon in the hill country that makes you feel that the year has been worth it, that the summer's work is completed and the beauty of the dying is everywhere. And the two men sat on the steps, and Hobart Gentry said nothing for a while, and then he said the thing. He said, "Gaddis, my uncle built this building." Gaddis said, "I know that." Hobart said, "He built it on old stone because old stone was there, and he needed a foundation, and that is what a sensible man does. He did not ask who put the stone there. He was not the asking kind." Gaddis did not say anything. Hobart said, "But I have been coming to this building every Sunday of my life since my mother first brought me here when I was not big enough to see over the pew rail, and I know this building the way you know a person who has always been in your life, and I know it knows things that nobody taught it. I know that because I know what was taught here and what was not, and the things it knows that were not taught are more than the things that were. That is just a fact," he said. "And I made my peace with that a long time ago, because what that building knows about me, from all the Sundays I have been in it, is everything there is to know. And what it has done with that knowing is kept it. And I am an old man, and my wife is dead, and my children are in Knoxville, and I am going to die in this hollow, and the building is going to hold what it holds of me, and that is more continuity than most men get, and I am grateful for it." That is Hobart Gentry, a man who understood the building's offer clearly and accepted it with the simple gratitude of a person who has been given a gift that fits exactly the shape of the need they have. He was not afraid. He was not mystified. He was not looking for an explanation. He had made his peace with a building that kept what was said in it, and his peace with it was the peace of a man who understood that his own keeping was the point. He stayed until the last Sunday. He listened to Orrin Gaddis read what the building gave to read. He walked out into the March morning, and he drove home down the hollow road, and he lived another 7 years, and he did not go back to the bench, and when he died he was at home in the hollow, in the house he had been born in, and he was, as far as anyone could tell from the reports of his last days, at peace. I do not know what he heard in the reading on March 9th, 1961. I do not know what any of them heard, specifically, because the specific is what Gaddis would not repeat. But I know what Hobart Gentry was listening for. He was listening for the building to say his name in the voice it had been developing for 98 years, the voice that was the sum of everything spoken in it. He was listening to be known completely, and he was ready for it, because he had spent 70 years getting ready, one Sunday at a time. There is a version of every life that is, at its center, a practice of showing up to the same place, in the same way, at the same time, for long enough that the place and the practice become the same thing. Not all lives have that. Not many, these days. But the lives that do have it are the lives that understand something about continuity that the rest of us are only occasionally granted a glimpse of. Hobart Gentry had that. Cressida Ogle had it. Orrin Gaddis had it in a different form in the 20 years after, when he took it home with him and continued it alone, in his own house, in his own voice, in the evenings. And maybe that is the point. Maybe that is what the building was modeling for 98 years. Not anything supernatural, in the end, or not only that. Maybe the building was modeling what attention looks like when it is sustained, when it does not stop, when it continues past the occasion, past the need, past the logic of continuing, because continuity is the only form in which certain things can be real. A room that holds what is said in it. A spring that runs when the congregation is there. A foundation that has been fitted for longer than anyone can say. And a preacher who takes the names home with him and says them every night for 20 years into the dark and listens. What are we, finally, but the things that hold us? And what holds us is not always made of the same material we are made of. Sometimes it is stone. Sometimes it is the air of a room. Sometimes it is the voice of a building that has been listening for 100 years and knows you better than you know yourself, and says so, finally, on a Sunday in March, to 11 people in an old pew, and means every word. That is the whole of the case. That is every piece of it I have been able to find. And I want to say one more time, at the end, what I said at the beginning. I have not gone up to the bench. I want to be clear about that, because the obvious question is, why not? And the obvious answer is, fear. And I want to say honestly that fear is part of it, but only part. The larger part is the same thing that makes you put a book down before the last chapter sometimes, because the last chapter will end it, and the ending is a lesser thing than the not knowing. The building is more itself to me as a thing I have not entered. I have read the testimony of 11 people who were in it, and one woman who helped write the testimony, and one man who spent his last 20 years saying the names of the people who were in it, and all of them together have given me something that entering would probably not give me, which is the shape of the thing from the outside, the sense of it as a whole, the way you see a body of water best from above and not from in. But I also want to say this. If you have read through all of this with me, if you have stayed with it for this long, I think you have your own relationship to the question now, and your own feeling about what you would do. And that feeling is the point, or one of the points. Because what the building at the head of Weeping Hollow is asking, what it has been asking since 1863, is the same question every place that matters asks, in its own way, to the people who come to it. The question is whether you are willing to be held. Not touched, not seen, not even understood. Held, in the way a room holds what is said in it, in the way stone holds what has been absorbed into it, in the way a patient thing holds what it has been given, without demanding that you acknowledge the holding, without needing you to understand it, holding you simply because you were there, and because being there was enough. Whether you are willing to be held like that, by something that is not made of what you are made of, and that will outlast you, and that knows your name in its own way, in its own medium, in the particular form that stone takes when it learns a name. Are you? That is the question at the bottom of Weeping Hollow. And the 11 people on the morning of March 9th, 1961, said yes. said yes with their presence, with their listening, with the tears some of them shed in the pews, said yes in the amen at the end of the last benediction, and then they walked out into the March morning and let the building keep what it had gathered from them, because keeping is what it does, and because what it gathered from them over all those years was not a loss. It was an archive. It was the record of their lives in the form that outlasts lives, which is the form of being known by something that does not die. I am glad something will remember our names, Cressida Ogle wrote. And Orrin Gaddis said them every night, into the dark, and listened. And the building stands at the head of a hollow in eastern Tennessee, nailed shut, full, patient, in possession of everything it was given and everything it built from what it was given, which is more than we can say about most of what we build. And the spring runs on Sundays. Sleep well. Bar the door with the intention of someone who trusts what they are keeping, not someone who fears what is outside. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole of it. I will see you at the next case. There is one more thing I have been holding back, and I have been holding it back deliberately, not as a trick, but because its place is here, at the end, after everything else, when you have the whole shape of the case in your mind and can see what this thing fits into. It is about the Psalms. Orrin Gaddis kept his note in the book of Psalms, not at random, not because the Psalms happened to be where the book fell open. He was a deliberate man. He put the note in the Psalms because the Psalms were the texts he was closest to, the ones he had preached from most, the ones he had read from the pulpit at Calvary Rest more than any others, and the ones that the building had responded to most consistently in those moments, in those services, in those Sundays over 23 years, when the congregation and the room were in conversation. The Psalms are the texts in the biblical tradition that are most explicitly about the act of speaking aloud into the presence of something larger than the speaker. They are not narrative, not prophecy, not instruction. They are direct address. They are the human voice speaking into the air of a room in full knowledge that the room is not empty. Whether or not the room contains what the Psalms say it contains, the Psalms are written in the grammar of being heard, in the syntax of a voice that trusts the listening. Gaddis told Dr. Stout that he had always preached the Psalms differently from other texts. He said he preached them into the room in a more literal sense, that he felt when preaching a psalm that he was not interpreting but participating, that the psalm wanted to happen in a room that knew what to do with it, and that Calvary Rest was, of all the rooms he had preached in, the room that knew best what to do with a psalm. He said, "The Psalms were written for a room like that, for a room with stone in it, with water near it, with a history of people speaking into it for longer than anyone could remember. The Psalms assume that kind of room. They were written by people who had such a room, who knew what it felt like to speak into something that received you. And when you read them in a room that actually has those qualities, they do something they do not do in a room that does not," he said. They complete themselves. Not in the sense of finding an ending, in the sense of becoming what they were written to be. A psalm read in a room that holds it is a psalm that is fully a psalm. A psalm read in a room that does not hold it is still good, still beautiful, but it is a psalm that is reaching for something it cannot quite touch. He said, "At Calvary Rest, it touched." That is what the note in the Psalms means, not a sentimental choice, not a casual placement. He put the instructions for the nightly naming in the book that represented what he was doing, the tradition he was working in, the grammar of speaking into something that holds you. He put it there because the Psalms are the tradition's own record of what it means to be in relationship with a room that knows your name. And maybe that is the deepest thing in this whole case, and the most ordinary, that the building at the head of Weeping Hollow was doing, in its own slow stone way, what the Psalms have always described. Not a monster, not a haunting, not an anomaly, just a place that had learned over a very long time, the practice that human beings had been describing as sacred for 3,000 years. The practice of holding the name, the practice of knowing the voice, the practice of receiving what is given and keeping it faithfully past the occasion of the giving, into the dark, with patience, without demanding acknowledgement or return. That practice has a lot of names in a lot of traditions. You can call it sacred ground. You can call it consecrated space. You can call it the presence of the holy. You can call it what Cressida Ogle called it, which she never named directly, only described. You can call it what Hobart Gentry called it, which was simple continuity, the comfort of being held in a place that does not die. Or you can call it what it is on its own terms, which is a piece of limestone that was fitted into a room by hands we cannot name, for a purpose we cannot fully recover, in a hollow that already had a name when the first white settlers found it, a name that gestures at something without explaining it, the way the right names always do. Weeping Hollow. Not a name of grief, or not only that, a name of water. A name of something emerging from the ground, persistently, from deep underground, rising in the form of spring water and the form of a spring song and the form of what a spring song does to a room built above it, which is fill it, slowly, over years and years, with the sound of water rising. The hollow wept in the old sense. The one before grief took the word. The hollow seeped, the way the ground seeps in that country, and the seeping came up through the stone and into the fitted room and into the building above it and into the air of the building and into the voices of the people, who came every Sunday and sang, and the singing went back down into the stone, and the stone remembered, and added to its remembering the memory of everything it had heard, and added to that the memory of the next thing heard, and on for 98 years, until the morning. The stone had enough memory to speak back in a full voice one last time through the mouth of an 82-year-old preacher with large chapped hands who had spent 23 years learning to let the building preach through him. And then it was done, and the building rested, and the hollow still weeps, which is to say the spring still rises, which is to say the stone still remembers, which is to say the names are still in there, in the dark, warm and held and not going anywhere. 81 years now since the last service. The names have been in the stone for 81 years, and the stone is old and patient and full. And at the end, if you listen, you might hear something, or you might not hear anything at all. And either way you will have been in the presence of something worth being in the presence of, which is a place that takes its holding seriously. I hope you will remember that. I hope, wherever you are tonight, wherever this found you, in whatever room or car or bed or dark corner you listened from, I hope you will remember that you are always, in some sense, in a room like that, always being held by something older than you, something that does not require your understanding to do its work, something that will still be there when you are not, holding what you gave it in the form it can keep. You are always in that room. The question is only whether you know it. Tell me what room you are in, not literally. Tell me what holds you. Tell me what you have found yourself in the presence of that kept your name. I am listening. This room, whatever room this is listening. And somewhere, in a hollow in eastern Tennessee, in the stone of a fitted room below the floor of a nailed-shut church, something has been listening for 160 years and does not plan to stop. Say your name tonight before you sleep. Say it out loud, into whatever room you are in. Something will hear it. Something always does. Good night. I want to sit with the case a little longer, because I think there is something I have not given you yet about the way the hollow worked on people over time, and the way it worked on Gaddis in particular in the years just before the end, and I think you need it to fully understand the morning. The years between 1959 and 1961 were the last 2 years. 2 years with a congregation of between 11 and 14 people in a building that was doing increasingly difficult things to the air and the sound and the weekly experience of being inside it. 2 years in which Gaddis held the services, week by week, and did not stop, and did not allow the building's intensification to become a reason to close earlier than the building itself indicated. I say it that way, that he did not allow the building's intensification to become a reason to close, because that is the way he described his own reasoning in those years. He said that the decision about when to stop was not his to make. He said he understood his role as the preserver of the space for whatever the building was building toward, and that his judgment about when the building had arrived at what it was building toward was simply not needed, because the building would tell him, and he believed it would tell him. And it did, he said. I knew from the first service in January of 1961 that the year would be the last. Not because I had decided, because the building told me, in the same way it had always told me things, which is not in words and not in visions, but in quality. The quality of the room changed in January. The room was gathered, the room was ready, and I understood that what it was ready for was something that could not be indefinitely delayed, and that my work in those last months was to hold the service steady and the congregation present, and not to hurry it, and not to slow it down. He said, "That is the most demanding kind of ministry there is. To hold something steady while it moves toward its own completion, without interfering, without hastening, without your own need to participate getting in the way of the thing's need to complete itself." He said, "I had 23 years of practice at it, and I needed every year." The congregation in those last 2 years knew, as they had always known, what was happening. They did not talk about it in the way people talk about things they have decided with their heads. They talked about it the way people talk about the weather, in observations and small comparisons, in noticing rather than explaining. Cressida Ogle wrote in her journal in the fall of 1960 that the building was like a garden in late October, and that she was saying that not as a metaphor, but as a precise description. She meant that it was the particular quality of a thing that has produced what it was growing and is now, slowly, folding back, turning back toward the root, preparing to hold what it has made, rather than continue making. She wrote, "This is not dying. This is not even ending. This is the way a year ends when the year has been good, with its full weight of what it made settling into itself. I am not afraid. I am attending. Attending is everything I have left to do. Attending." She used that word for what the congregation was doing in those last 2 years, and it is the right word, because attendance is not just presence. Attendance is the act of being present to something in a way that honors the thing you are present to, that does not put yourself between your observation and the thing observed. 19 of the congregation who had been members in the decade before the end chose not to attend, chose, for whatever reasons, to be elsewhere on the Sunday mornings when the building was doing what it was doing. Those people are not villains in the story, and I want to say that clearly. They made a choice that was rational and understandable and probably wise for them specifically, because what the building was offering in those years required a certain quality of readiness to receive, and not everyone has that quality, and there is nothing wrong with not having it. But the 11 who stayed had it. And what it looked like from the outside is simply this: they came every Sunday. In the wet and the cold of a Tennessee winter, and the heat of the Tennessee summer, and the indeterminate gray of the spring, and the bright grief of the fall, they drove up the hollow road, and they climbed the lane to the bench, and they went in and sat in their usual seats, and they listened to the building and to each other and to the preacher, and then they drove back down. 11 people, 40 Sundays a year, 2 years. That is 80 Sundays, plus the ones in the months before, the months when the congregation was still 14 or 15 and dwindling. Call it 100 Sundays roughly, of a congregation attending to something that required attending to, and on the 101st, or whatever Sunday it was, the building spoke. There is a line in one of the Psalms about waiting for the Lord as the watchmen wait for the morning. Gaddis had preached from it many times over the years, and the congregation at Calvary Rest had sat in their pews and heard it and sung the verse and given it back. And what the line says, in the plain language of the old translation, is that the waiting is active. It is not passive waiting, not the waiting of resignation. It is the waiting of a watchman, which is to say, the waiting of someone who is alert, who is attending, who has accepted the responsibility of watching for the thing that is coming and being ready when it comes. The 11 people on the morning of March 9th, 1961, were watchmen. They had been waiting, attending, for years, and what they were watching for came. Now I want to tell you about the week before the last Sunday, because the week before matters, and I have not told you enough about it. Monday through Saturday of the week of March 6th, 1961, Gaddis's last 6 days as the active preacher of a congregation that still had a building. He did not know they would be the last 6 days. Or he knew in the way he knew things that the building told him, which is not the same as knowing you will be doing something for the last time. He did not have a date circled. He did not tell the congregation this Sunday would be the last. He did not prepare himself the way you prepare yourself for a last thing. He prepared himself the way he always prepared himself, which is to say thoroughly and without ceremony, because ceremony is for the thing itself, not for the preparation. He spent Monday on visits. He drove to 3 houses in the surrounding country, not hollow houses, but the wider community he served, and he sat with people who were sick or old or in some difficulty, and he was what he had always been, which is a man who could sit with people in hard times and be genuinely present to them. He was good at that work all the way to the end. The pastoral visit is the invisible center of what a country preacher does, the thing that does not appear in any official record, and that is, more often than not, the thing most remembered by the people who received it. He spent Tuesday writing. He had a small desk in the house he rented 2 miles down the hollow, a house that the county parsonage fund paid for, and he sat at that desk on Tuesday and wrote the sermon he intended to preach the following Sunday, which was about the Psalms, about the voice speaking into the dark of a room that knows how to receive it. He wrote the sermon fully, as he always did, even though he rarely read from notes in the pulpit. He said writing the sermon fully was the practice of the thinking, and reading from notes was secondary to that. The thinking was the prayer, and the writing was the thinking made visible. He spent Wednesday on the building itself. He drove up the lane in the morning, and he unlocked the church, and he checked the stove and the windows and the floor, the routine maintenance he had done every week for 23 years, and he spent longer than usual that day, walking the room slowly, running his hands along the backs of the pews, standing at the pulpit with his hands on the wood. He said, in his account to Dr. Stout, that he was not aware of making it a special day. He said it was only in retrospect that he recognized what he had been doing, which was saying goodbye to the building in a form he had available to him, which was the form of attention he gave to it every Wednesday, but deeper on that particular Wednesday, more completely, as though he understood somewhere below the level of decision that this was the last Wednesday he would do it. He put his hands on the walls. He stood in the northeast corner above the trapdoor. He went to the windows and looked out at the bench in the cold March afternoon, the brown grass and the bare trees and the spring running in its channel. He stood in the doorway for a long time before he locked up. He wrote nothing about that afternoon. He told Dr. Stout about it briefly, more briefly than the importance of it would suggest, and I think the brevity is the honesty. Some things are their own complete experience and lose something in the telling. What he told Dr. Stout was this. He stood at the door before he locked it, and he said, aloud, to the empty room, "Thank you." Not for anything specific, just "thank you." And he said the room answered him in its way, in the low resonance that had become familiar over the years, and that what he heard in it, or what he interpreted what he heard in it, was something like, "I know." Thursday, Friday, Saturday. He prepared the service. He practiced the sermon, which for him meant speaking it aloud in the house, walking through it from beginning to end, refining it. He prepared the readings. He chose the hymns. And he chose them knowing, or choosing not to know, which is sometimes the same thing, that whatever hymns he chose would be the last hymns, and whatever reading he chose from the pulpit would be either the reading he had prepared or something else, and that the something else was the possibility he could not prepare for, but could be ready for. He said, "I knew the building might have something to say that Sunday. I had been feeling it for months, the gathered quality I described to you, and I knew that my sermon and my prepared readings might be set aside in the same way my prepared text was set aside. The time the building first spoke directly to me, in 1959, at the pulpit, I knew that might happen again, and what I prepared for that morning was not an alternative reading, but an alternative posture, a posture of readiness. I would come to the pulpit with what I had, and I would hold it lightly, and if the building needed the pulpit for what it had to say, I would give it the pulpit. That is the kind of preacher he had become. That is what 23 years in that building made him. A man who could come to the highest point of his work, the Sunday morning with the congregation in the pews, and hold his own preparation lightly enough that it could be put down, without shame, if something larger needed the space. Most of us, in whatever work we do, cannot do that. Most of us cannot put down our preparation when the moment calls for something our preparation did not anticipate. We hold on to what we worked for. We deliver what we rehearsed. We substitute our plan for the presence of the thing itself. Orrin Gaddis put down his plan. And what happened in the space his plan had been occupying is what 11 people witnessed on the morning of March 9, 1961. I have told you what Harriet Deal said about it. I have told you what Cressida Ogle wrote. I have told you what Gaddis himself said to Dr. Stout, which was as much as he was going to say and more than I expected. Let me add one more piece, from a source I have not mentioned yet, because I have been saving it. Ida Merrill, the oldest member of the congregation that morning, 81 years old, the woman who had been attending services at Calvary Rest since before Gaddis arrived, and possibly before any of the other 11 were born. She died in 1964, 3 years after the last service, and she gave an interview to a woman writing a local history of the county in 1963, the year before she died, and in that interview she talked about Calvary Rest, and about the last service, and about what she heard. She did not describe the words. She said she could not put the words into other words. She said the reading was in English, it was recognizable English, it was not mysterious or foreign or coded in any way, and yet when she tried to repeat any of it, she found she could not because she had forgotten, but because the words, once spoken in that room on that morning, in that voice, were not portable. They were specific to that occasion in the same way a piece of music is specific to the hall where it was performed, and removing them from that hall removes something essential from them. But she said one thing about the experience of hearing the reading that is not in any other source, and that I believe, she said, for the first time in 81 years of sitting in that church, I did not feel like I was a living person in a room with the dead nearby. I felt like I was in a room with everyone who had ever been in it, and the living and the dead were just different positions in the same room, and the positions were temporary and the room was not. She said, that is what the reading said. Not in those words, but that is what it said. For the first time in 81 years, which means she had spent 81 years sitting in that building, feeling the presence of the dead nearby, which means the building had always been doing what I have been describing it as doing, holding the dead in proximity to the living through the medium of the stone and the spring and the keeping of the names, and Ida Merrill had always felt it, and it had always been the slightly uncomfortable thing at the center of her Sunday experience in that room, the thing she did not speak of, but which she had been in the company of for 8 decades. And on the last morning, the reading resolved it, said out loud what had been present but unspoken for 98 years, and in saying it resolved the separation between the living congregation and the dead congregation into something that did not need to be separated at all. I do not know if that is consoling or frightening or both. I think it is both. I think the most real things are both. The stone holds your name, and the stone does not die, and you do not know what it is like to be held by something that does not die, and you will not know until you are in the position of being held. But I believe Ida Merrill. I believe her description, and I believe that what she felt in that moment was accurate. And I believe that the reading gave her, in the last 3 years of her life, something she had not had in the 81 years of sitting in that building, which is the peace of the thing being said out loud that she had always known but never heard. That is the gift of the last service. Not to the building, which had everything it needed and more. To the congregation. To the 11 people who had stayed long enough to be there when the building finally spoke. To all of them, in their different ways and for their different reasons, the gift of the thing being said, and then the gift of being released. Because that is what the last Sunday also was. The building, having said what it had to say, released the congregation. They had served as its medium, its instrument, the voices through which it had accumulated what it needed to accumulate for their whole lives in that hollow, and now it was done with that service, and it said so, clearly, through the mouth of the preacher, and the congregation received the release the way you receive the end of a long labor that was also a long love, which is with grief and with relief, and with the knowledge that what you gave was worth the giving, and that what was made from the giving will outlast you. Cressida Ogle said it has enough. She said it simply, one sentence, in the afternoon after the service. Enough is the right word. Not too much, not finished in the sense of depleted. Enough in the sense of complete. A room that has enough is a room that does not need more, and a room that does not need more is a room that is at rest. The building at the head of Weeping Hollow is at rest, and the spring runs on Sundays, and the names are in the stone, and that is everything I know. That is the whole of it. Thank you for sitting with me in this one. It is the longest I have spent on a case, and the one I have thought about the most, and I am glad you were here for it. Leave me where you are. Leave me what held you. Leave me the name of the room where you have felt the most like you were being kept. I will carry those into the next one. Sleep well. One final thing. A small thing that resists the larger narrative. So I am putting it here, at the very end. When the Landers County Historical Society stabilized the Springhouse in 2003 and found the tin box behind the loose stone in the east wall, the stone that had been loose long enough to be moved without mortar dust, they documented everything around the box as well as the box itself. The stone was photographed in situ. The cavity behind it was measured. The tin box and its contents were cataloged. And in the cataloging, one item was noted that does not appear in the official report, but that appears in the field notes of the woman who did the documentation, a detail she observed and wrote down and then, by her own account, chose not to include in the formal record because she could not verify it and did not know what to say about it. The inside of the cavity, she wrote, behind the stone and around the tin box was warm, not room temperature, warm, the warmth of a living temperature, the warmth of a hand, in the stone wall of a structure that had been unheated and exposed to a cold March Tennessee morning for decades. She wrote, "I put my hand in, and it was warm. The space around the box was warm." She wrote, "I did not include this in the report. I am giving it to you now. Good night."